I did not make this fanfic. Support the author's work in the link below. The Capture Scarf Caper by Dlldarkwolf Moon. Izuku found Eraserhead's capture scarf in an alleyway while trying to find the man himself and decided to take it home. They say imitation is the highest form of flattery, so hopefully the hero won't be too upset if he ever finds out about it. In the meantime, Izuku might just be able to become a hero without a quirk, so he's certainly going to try. Notes: okay, so this one is my little sister's fault. I sort of fell out of the habit of posting the other fics I'm working on because my muse is manic and decides to cycle between projects like a kid trying to decide what to get from a candy store. And then an email about student loans sort of sent me into panic mode around the same time, so anxiety sort of sucker punched me as well. But ultimately this one is her fault because I made the mistake of mentioning this AU to her and she'd either forgotten I ever mentioned it before, or she just wasn't around when I talked about it with my brother. Either way, she literally demanded that I post it, even going so far as to pester me this morning about whether I'd posted yet since I promised her I'd do it Wednesday. Also, this spawned from a post I saw on Terrible My Hero Academia else on Tumblr. As of right now, I have 4 complete chapters and 3/4 THS of Chapter 5 done. Hopefully you all enjoy what I'm doing with this idea. See the end of the work for other works inspired by this one. Chapter 1. Chapter text. Izuku knew he wasn't supposed to be out that late at night. It wasn't going to stop him anytime soon, but he knew he wasn't supposed to be wandering the alleyways so long after dark. Especially since he was only 12. His mind was buzzing with all the things that could go wrong, but somehow nothing he could think of was worse than going to school in the morning. So he kept walking. He wasn't about to tell Kachan that he was an excellent motivator to get over his fears. His childhood friend would never forget it, would probably use it as ammunition against him. That wasn't the point, though. He wasn't out so late for his health or to prove anything. Well, he reflected, he might be trying to prove something, but it was only to himself. He was trying to find Eraserhead. There had been a couple of notable arrests recently, brought in by an unnamed hero. The footage Izuku had seen online had Eraserhead's signature capture scarf as the sole identifying feature in the videos. Well, that and the image of an alley across from a bar. What was more, it was an area Izuku was familiar with, which was why he was out on the streets trying to see if Eraserhead was still in the area. Walking around late at night was unusual. He was the only one around and his footsteps echoed around him oddly. It was like someone else was walking behind him, but no one was there when he turned to look. And yet it still wasn't as scary as facing down an angry Kachan. Izuku found the alleyway almost too soon. He hadn't seen many people in the streets, though a couple stumbled out of the bar across the street and wandered in the vague direction of the nearest train station. He turned down the alley and let his eyes adjust to the lower light level. It was almost disappointing how normal the alley looked. The smell of rotting garbage, stagnant water, and old vomit cluttered the atmosphere, but that was to be expected. Alleyways weren't clean, and they weren't usually a priority to be cleaned. A few large garbage and recycling bins were pushed up against one building, but whoever was supposed to be using them didn't seem to care much because there were bits of trash scattered about. Including, oddly, something that looked like a long compression bandage. Izuku frowned. That wasn't exactly something people just threw away. They were reusable and useful. He wandered over to pick it up. It was a lot heavier than he was expecting it to be and it rustled when he touched it. Frowning again, Izuku pulled his hand back. Whatever this was, it wasn't a compression bandage. Realization slowly trickled over him as he reached to pick it up again and it moved in his fingers. He was holding a capture scarf. And not just any capture scarf, Eraserhead's. Izuku's head shot up and he looked around suddenly. He was a Hero fanboy, he knew this, but to just take it was a step too far in his mind. It was like stealing, even if it had been left behind for whatever reason. Maybe it was malfunctioning? Maybe the villain Eraserhead took down had somehow managed to break it. Eraserhead didn't strike him as the sort of person to leave his main weapon behind, but it had been a couple days since the fight, and it was still here. As wrong as the idea of taking it was, Izuku's mind raced through all the worst-case scenarios he could think of. What if a villain we got their hands on it, someone who encountered Eraserhead often? They could study it, maybe learn how to neutralize it. Although Izuku didn't doubt the man would adapt, it wasn't worth taking the risk. He gathered the scarf in his arms. Well, he tried to gather it in his arms. It was like trying to hold a bunch of writhing snakes as the loops moved under his hands like it was trying to run away from him. Maybe that was why it was still in the alley. As he tried to settle it in some form of order, he felt a sharp pinch on his upper arm. Apparently, snakes were too accurate a metaphor. Fortunately, though, the scarf settled after causing him pain. A dry voice in the back of his mind pointed out how much it was like everything else in his life, practically impossible until it causes him enough pain to be satisfied. Izuku pushed that voice back as far as he could. He was just projecting bad feelings on an inanimate object and that wasn't fair. He took the scarf back home and managed to sneak back into the house without his mother noticing that he'd gone missing in the first place. By the cold light of day, Izuku looked at the scarf again where he had deposited it just inside his closet. He reached to touch it and it reached back. He panicked, flinging himself back and away from it. Just in time, apparently, as it started thrashing around again. He wasn't touching it, but it was freaking out almost as much as he was. He froze, and so did the scarf. As far as he was aware, the scarf wasn't actually alive. Was it? The very idea was terrifying. And weird. And a little bit funny when it wasn't freaking him out. Most people brought home stray dogs or cats, but Izuku, he had to bring home a potentially sentient capture scarf. He wasn't even sure why he was surprised by this new level of absurdity. At least it probably didn't need to eat. Probably. Izuku crossed the hall to the bathroom just to do something to distract himself. It was only when he was staring at his reflection in the mirror that he remembered the strange pinch in his arm right before the scarf settled down. Pulling up his sleeve, there was a small scratch in the same general area. One part of the scratch was deeper than the rest, almost like a puncture wound of some sort. How he would have gotten it from a scarf he didn't know, but it cemented in his mind the need for research. He needed to know everything he could find out about the capture scarf itself, be it speculation or something else. Fortunately for Izuku, it was Sunday. He didn't think he'd be able to think about anything else other than this problem, and his distraction around Kachan was a recipe for disaster and chemical burns, neither of which he welcomed at the best of times, least of all when he was unable to mitigate as much of the damage. Once he was back in his room, the capture scarf rustling softly on the floor of his closet, he booted up his laptop and made his way to the underground hero pages. He knew it wouldn't be the best information and there was no guaranteeing it would be at all accurate, but he needed somewhere to start, and that was where most of the speculation about Eraserhead's capture scarf ended up. There was a lot of speculation about it, more than he'd been expecting, and no one could quite agree what it was supposed to be. Someone suggested that Eraserhead's control of the scarf was his quirk, rather like Best Jeanist's ability to control certain fabrics. Others thought it was just a good support item, perhaps bound to the hero through some form of DNA link. One of the more obscure theories said that the scarf wasn't actually all that special at all and Eraserhead had learned to use it like a lasso. No one really believed that because the footage that could be found of some of Eraserhead's fights showed the scarf moving in ways that couldn't be replicated with rope. All of that to say no one knew how it worked, but Izuku knew it somehow had a degree of independent movement with even a small amount of human contact. He had touched it, and suddenly it was moving. The longer he'd held it, the more it moved. Something had changed between then and now since it was reaching for him and moving or stopping when he did. Something had happened to what? Bind it to him? Was there some sort of sentience in it that decided it liked him? Did it have something to do with the scratch on his arm? He sighed. None of his questions were going to be answered by the forums because Eraserhead wasn't about to tell people about his main weapon. Izuku had an advantage over all the theorists on the internet, though. He actually had access to a capture scarf. It fluttered in his arms as he picked it up off the floor of his closet, less violent than the night before and he still wasn't sure why. It wrapped around his wrists like an affectionate cat twining around its owner's legs and Izuku just sighed. Whether it was sentient or not, He was probably going to have to get used to these sorts of movements. He was probably also going to start talking to it as if it were sentient, because you never know, and he wanted to be polite. "Can you hold still please?" he asked as he set the scarf down on his desk. "I just want to look at you." Instantly, it stilled under his fingers and Izuku put another mental check under possibly sentient in his head. As gently as he could, he arranged the capture scarf in a loop so he could examine it inch by inch to figure out what had stabbed him in the arm. Now that he was paying attention to it, the strange fabric, though heavy, was softer than he was expecting it to be. It sort of glittered under the light, so it had to be reinforced in some way, and there was no doubt in his mind that some of this had to be micro-technology that enabled the scarf to move on its own. But it was still soft and supple against his fingertips. It was like holding titanium lacework. For all he knew, it was actually made of titanium. It wasn't until he reached the middle of the scarf that he found something that wasn't soft. He knew this was the part that had jabbed him because there was a little bit of blood on the fabric, but whatever jagged part had been there wasn't there anymore, leaving behind a slim, flexible capsule that looked like it was partially filled with liquid mercury. Well, he called it a capsule, but it was more like a small envelope that the scarf almost appeared to grow out of, like the branches of a tree from the trunk. Though the trunk was a flat, translucent pouch of something semi-liquid. The contents flowed and swirled. Whatever was inside reacted to his touch, following his thumb as he swiped it across the surface instead of being pushed away. Then, while he was still holding it, part of the capsule distended slightly, forming a small point that jabbed his thumb. He pulled away quickly enough to watch the silvery substance disappear under his skin. "I hope that's not poisonous," Izuku muttered, pressing a handkerchief against the small puncture wound as he looked back at the scarf. "Although, if it was, I'd probably be dead already from last night." He couldn't completely discount the idea, as it could be a safety feature to prevent someone else from using Eraserhead's scarf if they weren't him. But he didn't feel any the worse for wear, and clearly whatever it had done had affected what it was able to do and how it reacted to him. Moreover, Izuku was pretty sure that if he were to try to put on the capture scarf the way Eraserhead did, the capsule would be sitting against his spine. When he turned back to his examination, he found a small symbol printed on the capsule. It was a Western-style dragon with the letters KSSI written in the open space between the body and the curve of the tail that looped around toward the head. Now that he had something of a direction, Izuku typed what he assumed was a company acronym into an online search engine to see what came up. Kaplan Stark Support Industries. The logo appeared on his screen next to the list of search results, all of which offered to take him to specific pages on the official site or waxed poetic about the sort of things they were capable of. The first thing that caught Izuku's attention was the fact that, unlike what he'd been expecting, Kaplan Stark didn't typically make hero gear. They were better known for prosthesis, the best available on the market due to their innovative use of nanotechnology. Of course, they wouldn't advertise that they were the company to make Eraserhead's capture scarf, as that could easily compromise the hero in the field. But now Izuku had the scarf and he knew they were responsible for it. The pieces made sense. The scarf was laced with nanotechnology, the capsule was probably full of a saline slurry full of nanobots, and some connection between that and him had been made. Izuku scrolled down and selected one of the videos that claimed to explain what their nanotechnology did. A mildly informative 3 hours later had Izuku sitting back in his chair, looking at the scarf with awe and more than a little trepidation. The videos described the use of nanobots in the average prosthetic as bridging the gap between the mechanical arm and the central nervous system. The nanobots were self-replicating to a certain point, using trace amounts of minerals and nutrients already found in the blood to create more bots to keep the system running. There was a threshold the nanobots weren't allowed to surpass, and the defunct bots were recycled by the body. The difference between the normal prosthetic and the capture scarf, however, was that a prosthetic replaced a missing body part while the scarf was not technically part of the body at all. The videos didn't expound upon this as it wasn't something they advertised as a commercial product. It did explain that the prosthetic was not sentient regardless of whatever strange movements people had observed, whether or not it was attached, as this was the brain trying to assimilate new or renewed input from the missing limb. The nanobots operated on a closed network with one another, and so contact was not required for them to receive signals for movement. Privately, Izuku was still sure there was something about the scarf that wasn't exactly the same, so he would probably still talk to it like a person. It couldn't hurt his reputation more than it was already damaged by being quirkless. Having 20 meters worth of capture scarf that he talked to sometimes wasn't going to be any weirder than that. It wasn't until that moment he realized he didn't intend to return it. While he didn't have a way of getting in contact with Eraserhead, it wasn't that hard to find someone who knew him or could get in contact with him. But no part of Izuku's plans had him tracking the man down to return the scarf. This was probably exactly why people called him a creepy stalker. He had gone out actively looking for Eraserhead, had found his capture scarf instead, and decided to keep it instead of returning it like a normal person. Shame burned in his gut, but it wasn't enough to change his mind, especially as the scarf wound itself around him like a hug. He wanted to learn to use it, to train his brain to wield it like an extra limb the way Eraserhead used his. The man clearly had another one if he wasn't too concerned about losing it in the alleyway. It had been cast aside like him, and even if it didn't have feelings, he couldn't stop himself from drawing the connections between it and himself. Besides, Eraserhead used his capture scarf as an equalizer against more physically powerful quirks. That was exactly what Izuku needed. He just hoped the hero wouldn't begrudge him taking the chance while it was in front of him. Izuku tried to wear the scarf the same way as Eraserhead at first, but he quickly realized that he would either be written off as an idiot for wearing a scarf as big as it was when he didn't need one, or someone would recognize it and get it taken away. Leaving it at home wasn't an option in his mind, so he managed to find a way to twine the scarf around his torso and arms under his Gakuran so he would always have it. After a couple months of practice with it, he managed to make wrapping it around him in the morning second nature. He was constantly warm for the extra layer it offered, but he would sacrifice his physical comfort for the protection it offered. It was resistant to a lot of the damage Bakugo and others tended to do to him, and Izuku started having less injuries to deal with after school. He had begun exercising as well, realizing that if he wanted to get into UA on his own merits, he probably had to have some physical skills to back up the capture scarf and his analysis. He was already pretty quick on his feet, which was necessary if he wanted to escape bullies at the end of the day, or during lunch. He hadn't really found a reliable way to work on strength, but he was attending as many free self-defense classes as he could. Working with the scarf itself was slow going as he needed to train himself to use it like another limb, and he had no idea how to do that without focusing on every movement he needed it to make. His best idea was to use it as often as possible for little things as well as bigger things. More delicate movements were harder to do, and he spent a good portion of the first few months trying to pick up a pencil from the cup of writing utensils on his desk without knocking it over. Larger things, however, were simple enough if he managed to get a grip. One of the first things he realized was that, barring his ability to focus on the action, there were few physical limits on what the scarf could lift. It wasn't an actual limb, so it wasn't gated by his physical strength. Moreover, he could use them to pull his body around, climbing trees and buildings with ease. The only physical limit he had encountered was whether he could brace himself well enough to leverage whatever he was trying to lift up. It was honestly easier to pull himself along until he had the strength to stand his ground. No one at school had noticed Izuku's new accessory. It wasn't exactly surprising since he was actively trying to hide it and people only paid attention to him when they wanted to hurt or belittle him. He was glad his classmates didn't know him well enough to tell that he was hiding something. At one point in time, Kachan might have been able to tell, but they hadn't been that close in years. Izuku knew him, but Kachan didn't see enough of Izuku to be able to read his reactions and emotions anymore. It was a bit harder to hide it from his mother, but he was managing. When he wore short sleeves, he explained that the bandages on his arms were for the training he was doing. It wasn't even a lie and she didn't question it, seeing how serious he had become about training recently. She had even offered to pay for lessons and something he wanted to learn to help out. Once he stopped crying about the unconditional show of support, he mentioned his short list of desired skills: parkour, martial arts, and gymnastics. All of them could help him as a hero in the future. parkour was for navigating through a city at speed, avoiding obstacles and minimizing injuries from a fall. Martial arts were something he was already pursuing, the need to be physically capable of fighting back against people regardless of their quirk at the forefront of his mind. Gymnastics was also in the vein of learning to tumble and fall, but he also wanted to be able to maneuver in the air, which was necessary with how he used the capture scarf to get around. In the end, he elected to go with gymnastics. It was a sport with strength, speed, and agility as the main requirements, and he needed to learn to be more instinctual with his body and with the scarf. And since most gyms weren't equipped for quirk use, the focus wouldn't be on what people could do with them. Hopefully, the fact he was quirkless wouldn't come up at all. Izuku had been practicing for almost 3 years with the capture scarf. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being Eraserhead's and started being his, though he couldn't be sure when that happened. He didn't have the right words to explain how comforting it was to have it sitting against his skin every day, but the knowledge that it was there was rooted deep enough in his soul to make even the bad days just a little brighter. Which was a good thing because this was turning out to be one of the worst. Their homeroom teacher had career forms he was meant to pass out, but he threw them up in the air and said everyone obviously wanted to be heroes. Which wasn't wrong, but it seemed weird for him to come out and say that, ignoring what he was supposed to be doing in favor of indulging a class full of teenage egos. Kachan, of course, stated his intention to attend UA and become the best hero, better even than All Might. This led to the teacher revealing that Izuku had stated an interest in attending UA as well. That was the moment Izuku knew the end of the day wasn't going to be pleasant for him. The entire room turned and laughed at him for his impossible dream. It hurt to see all their mocking faces even though he knew they would never believe in him. The look of murder in Kachan's eyes cut deeper than any of the rest of it. Even though he knew they weren't friends anymore, nothing cemented it more in his mind than the clear and present danger radiating off Kachan. Unseen by those around him, the capture scarf tightened around his ribcage in a sort of hug. He knew he was the one controlling it, but it was still nice to have something tactile to ground him. In full view of the teacher and the rest of the class, Kachan blasted his desk, the force of which threw him into the wall at the back of the classroom. "You think you can get into UA? You're totally quirkless." Kachan laughed as though it was the funniest thing he had ever heard. So did the rest of the class. "I just want to try," Izuku mumbled. "What's so wrong about that?" "Try what? Try the entrance exam?" Kachan barked another laugh. "What can you even do?" Izuku stayed silent while the class hovered over him. He wouldn't provide them with more ammunition than they already had. They were already certain of the outcome, so sure that he was going to fail. Anything else he could have said was just another reason to mock him. Izuku tried to leave quickly after class. He reached for his analysis notebook to put it away, only to have it ripped out of his hands. "We aren't finished here, Deku," Kachan purred, the dark tone sending a shiver down his spine. He glanced down at Izuku's notebook and scoffed. "For my future? Are you for real?" "Give it back." Izuku reached to grab it, only for Kachan to put the notebook between his palms and set off an explosion. He moved to the window to throw it out, where it would probably land in the koi pond below, damaging it more. It was instinct when the end of the capture scarf shot out of his sleeve to grab the book before it fell too far. Silence stretched in the room as Kachan and his friends stared at him. So much for keeping that a secret, Izuku thought. He didn't bother to wait around for the moment of shock to wear off. He had his backpack, he had his notebook, and he had his capture scarf vibrating against his skin. He needed to get out of there and the window was right there. With a running leap, he shot out of the window, snagging the railing with his capture scarf on the way down. Using the excess momentum, he flung himself into a nearby tree and then slid carefully to the ground. "Deku!" Kachan yelled out the window behind him, but Izuku didn't bother to look. He just ran. Some things weren't worth sticking around to find out how bad they could be. When he was far enough away he didn't think Kachan would catch up to him. Izuku slowed down to catch his breath. His dreams had changed a bit over the years. Izuku had come to terms with the fact he couldn't be a hero like All Might, but he thought being like Eraserhead was mostly attainable. Something large and heavy landed on his back and he pitched forward, flailing wildly. Whatever it was slimy, and it moved, trying to dive down this throat. "I'm just hijacking your body. Calm down," a watery voice murmured. "It'll be over in 45 seconds." Izuku thrashed in the grasp of the slime villain, clawing at the junk pouring itself down his throat. "No point in trying that," the slime chuckled, moving one eye to stare down at him. "I'm fluid, you see." "Your eyes aren't." The capture scarf emerged from under his Gakuran and wrapped around the eye he could see before pulling sharply. Suddenly the slime villain was thrashing too. He hadn't stopped trying to pour himself down Izuku's throat, but the pressure on one of his eyes was causing enough pain that Izuku was able to get a quick breath every now and then. He was too preoccupied to hear the approach of someone else, so his only warning that he wasn't alone anymore was an eerily familiar voice shouting, "Texas Smash!" A blast of wind knocked the slime villain away, and Izuku choked on the slime still in his throat, vomiting it up as best he could. All in all, not the best way to meet one of his heroes. "Sorry you had to get caught up in that," All Might said. "I am a bit new to the area." Izuku nodded, suddenly unable to find any words. He wanted to ask the hero if he could be a hero too, but the jeering voices of his classmates echoed in his mind. "You seemed to be doing well yourself," the hero continued. "That's an excellent quirk you have." Izuku jolted, but before he could correct him about the capture scarf, the man was gone. He looked down at his hands. The scarf had retreated back under his sleeves again as it usually did. It hadn't occurred to him that people would look at his use of the capture scarf and assume it was a quirk. But most people didn't know about Eraserhead, and for good reason. The more people knew about him, the less effective he could be. Izuku hadn't intended to lie to the number one hero about having a quirk, but apparently that's what he had inadvertently done by failing to correct the misconception. Was that what Kachan thought too? Was that why he and his friends had gone so silent when Izuku retrieved his notebook? He started making his way home, trying to decide if he should pass off the capture weapon as a quirk. He could call it scarves, or something like that. If people assumed it was a quirk rather than a support item, would that change how they treated him? If he managed to convince them, he needed to prevent anyone from finding out anything different about it. He had learned through trial and error how to fix it, and through a lot of study. It was fortunate that the nanobots were largely self-replicating. Because of that, minor damage to the scarf was self-repairing, and he'd only needed to worry about a couple of times Kachan had practically burned through a layer. He had a theory that if he managed to remove some of the nanobots from the capsule and place them with enough raw materials that he'd be able to let them replicate another scarf. The whole weapon seemed to grow out of the capsule, after all, and the nanobots were self-replicating provided enough material. What he had gleaned from the KSSI videos told him that their prostheses could repair themselves to their proper functionality in time if they were severely damaged. It only made sense that they would do the same for a capture weapon made for a hero. And would Eraserhead have left the scarf behind if he didn't have another one? Probably not. Whether he could get another one from the company or he managed to replicate one the way Izuku was planning didn't matter as much as the fact that it was possible. There were 10 months until the UA entrance exam, and he was going to see if he could manage to grow another scarf in that time. If he could, maybe he would try to pass off the capture weapon as his quirk. If not, well, he would figure that out if it came to that. Chapter 2 Notes. Thanks to everyone who left comments and kudos on this. Rest assured, I have informed the little menace of your thanks and now she is unbearably smug. This update is dedicated to Padawan Angel 98 and a guest user going by Edgelord, who are my sisters. They have very different ways of motivating me to work on things. Padawan does the easier and more effective thing of acting like a sounding board for my ideas, while Edgelord, as her name suggests, threatens me. No, Edge, you are never going to have that talk with my muse. Even if she had a physical form you could assault, I wouldn't let you get anywhere near her. She wasn't made to focus on just one thing, and neither am I. Also, I just want to express my love to all those who have commented here, as it's such a polite commenting community compared to other places I've posted. I love the comments you leave me, and rest assured I read them all, even if I don't always respond. Chapter text. The day of the entrance exam arrived sooner than Izuku had been expecting, though somehow not soon enough. He had been busy in the 10 months since running into All Might and getting the idea of passing off his capture scarf as a quirk. It wasn't the best idea, but he found the choice was taken out of his hands almost immediately because of Kachan and his friends. The entire school was convinced that he'd spontaneously developed a quirk out of nowhere, though no one could quite agree if it were tentacles, fabric manipulation, or some kind of weird spider mutation. Naturally, he didn't demonstrate his quirk for anyone short of using it to escape from Kachan, but that didn't stop the teacher from slipping some paperwork to register his quirk on his desk the Monday after the rumors started. In a rare display of a magnanimous leader, Sensei even offered to turn the paperwork in for him. That he also made some remark about how it was about time he presented a quirk, Izuku decided not to correct him. Teachers had never helped him before, so he didn't see why he should help them. If the paperwork was filled out and left on the teacher's desk at the end of the day, there was no evidence that Izuku had been the one to do it. Any issues that came from turning it in would reflect on his teacher rather than him. Oddly, Izuku decided he was okay with this potential outcome, if only because he could imagine the face Sensei would make when he realized he'd helped a quirkless student commit fraud. Of course, a quirk known only as Tendril wasn't going to rate very highly in people's minds, so Izuku figured that moment would never actually come to pass. Replicating the scarf had become a bit of a priority after that. What saved him was a beach near his home that had become overrun with garbage. Or, from another perspective, it was filled with a wealth of raw materials just waiting to be broken down and used. He started cleaning up the beach, as it served several of his purposes. He could practice with the scarf, he had access to the materials, and all the lifting and moving was making him stronger. Add to that his habit of running from place to place, and his training was going well. He was getting stronger, faster, and building his endurance. Beyond that, he had developed his control over the scarf that he didn't need to focus on what it was doing at every moment to ensure it did what he wanted it to. Honestly, he needed to focus more to stop it from acting on his behalf. The first experiment with growing a scarf was a success, though he'd had to sacrifice a small collection of his old clothes to it. With a pile of scrap metal from the beach and those clothes, his backup scarf grew to its full 20 meters in 3 weeks. Which was about how long it was taking Izuku to begin wondering what would happen if he supplied the nanobots with different materials. Like the rubber tires he was pulling out of the mounds of trash on the beach. If he could get a higher quality of metal as well, the scarf that came out of that would be formidable. And if he managed to craft a scarf out of Kevlar or something that afforded a similar level of protection, he might prefer to use that, provided he got into the hero course. It was still surreal to him that getting into the hero course wasn't looking like a distant dream for someone else to achieve. According to what he had looked up, UA's entrance exam featured robots of varying values and prospective students were meant to destroy or disable as many as they could. There wasn't a lot to find on the robots themselves, but Izuku was fairly certain they would have a weak spot to exploit. If not, then the test was heavily geared toward people with destructive quirks, which was more than a little unfair. He was determined to do his best, but he also applied to the General Education Department just in case. With that, he was fairly certain he could make it into UA with his test scores and potentially move up to the Heroics Department in the sports festival. Even with that assurance, he was still a nervous wreck walking through the gates of UA. He was drifting, woefully off-kilter and still trying desperately to convince himself that everything was real. The familiar pressure of the capture scarf tightening around his ribs was grounding in a way little else was, and Izuku walked toward the building to take the written part of the test. Unfortunately, he tripped over his own feet shortly before the stairs. Fully expecting to land on his face, he was surprised when the impact never came. "Sorry for using my quirk on you without asking," said a voice behind him as he opened his eyes to see the ground centimeters away from his face. He was floating, flailing almost, without touching the ground. Izuku turned to look at the person who had spoken and locked eyes with a girl who stood beside him. She reached out to help pull him upright, then touched the tips of her fingers together. When she did, gravity reasserted itself and he landed on his feet, his wobbly knees protesting the renewed pressure of remaining upright. I think it's a bad omen to trip and fall." She smiled at him and Izuku tried to smile back through his nervous daze. "Thank you," he whispered, unsure what else to do. Of course. She glanced between him and the doors of the building. Well, we better get going. Good luck on the test. You too. He wasn't sure if she heard him or not, because she had already started moving to the building and Izuku couldn't manage anything louder than a whisper apparently. Once the written test was over, and Izuku was glad it was, even though he knew the harder part was yet to come, those who intended to test for the heroics department were collected in a large auditorium. President Mike stepped out on stage and began running through the specifics of the test, most of which Izuku had looked up online. He was glad he'd done that, as it was difficult to focus on what was being said while sitting next to Kachan. Kachan had tried cornering him at school, but Izuku used the school's rather blasé attitude regarding Quirk used to swing out the window with the capture scarf every time Kachan got too close. He could read his former friend's moods, and that was not a conversation he wanted to have alone. And since it was Kachan, it probably wasn't a conversation he wanted to have at all. He still wasn't sure what he had done to anger him. This is how the test will go, my listeners, President Mike was saying. You'll be experiencing 10-minute-long mock cityscape maneuvers. Bring along whatever you want. Izuku let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Even if it somehow came out that the capture scarf wasn't a Quirk, they couldn't ignore him if he managed to make it into the hero course. They said he could bring anything he wanted. If he'd brought a capture scarf, then he was simply better prepared than the rest of the test takers. Or more resourceful. Actually, it probably only counted as luck. He was lucky enough to find and figure out how to use a capture scarf, and there was nothing they could do about that right now. And if they took it away, he had more now, scarves that didn't originally belong to Eraserhead. If they tried to take them away, he would just grow more and hide them until they could never be sure they'd retrieved them all. He hoped that wouldn't happen. Shut up, Kachan growled. A student closer to the stage stood up. I have a question. There appears to be no less than 4 faux villains on this handout. Such a blatant terror, if it is one, is highly unbecoming of an institute as prestigious as UA. Then the boy turned and glared directly at Izuku. And you with the curly hair. You've been muttering this entire time and it's highly distracting. If you think this is some sort of game, then you should just leave. Izuku shrunk in his seat. He much preferred it when attention sort of slid off him. Now the whole auditorium was looking at him, if only briefly. The capture scarf tightened against him again, practically constricting his ribs and limiting his breathing. He forced himself to calm down as President Mike drew the attention of the room back to the front. Nice catch, examinee 7111, the voice hero said, easily smoothing over the crowd. The 4th type of faux villain is worth 0 points. There is only one protesting ground, a gimmick that rampages around in close quarters. Izuku stared down at the handout, at the pictures of each of the robots. There was no sense of scale to them as they stood against a white background, but he could already see a couple of places that might be weaknesses he could exploit. If not, he'd have to improvise more on the spot. Provided, of course, his anxiety didn't cause him to freeze up. After changing into a pair of sweatpants and a tank top, he followed the instructions to find his testing ground and joined the crowd gathered there. Well, join was perhaps not the right word. The testing ground was huge, as was the crowd, and he was terrified of dealing with either. He noticed the girl who had helped him at the gate. Before he could go over and thank her again, a heavy hand landed on his shoulder and he flinched. What do you think you're doing? The boy who called him out in the auditorium demanded. She's obviously going to do a meditation of some sort. Were you going to sabotage her? Izuku froze in the face of such animosity and he felt the eyes of the entire crowd turn to look at him again. Whispers raced through them, the familiar tone of mocking setting his stomach to tying itself in knots. He should have known nothing would really change. He should have known it was useless to try and reach out and begin. There was a moment of silence as everyone, Izuku included, attempted to process what had just been said. What's wrong? President Mike demanded. The test started. The die is cast. Everyone started running at once, Izuku choosing to race down side streets away from the main crowd. He couldn't handle the eyes on him, and being in the crush of the main battle wasn't going to do him any good. A robot appeared around one corner and Izuku froze for a second before the capture scarf lurched forward to find purchase on the machine and pull him into a flying kick at the one-pointer's main sensor array. It smashed under his shoes and he tore out a bundle of wires while swinging around to land on the ground again. He was running again before the robot hit the ground. He managed to take out a couple of two-pointers by getting them to shoot each other, then aimed straight for the bundle of exposed wires on the next one-pointer he saw. The first three-pointer was larger than he expected it to be, and someone with a laser in his stomach managed to take it out while it was focused on Izuku. "Merci pour l'assistance, mon ami," the boy called to him before moving on. Izuku vowed to take on the next three-pointer on his own. As if summoned by his desire to prove himself, one crawled over a partially collapsed building to get to him. Directing his scarf to wrap around a nicely sized piece of rubble, Izuku swung the makeshift shot put into the robot's sensor array before diving underneath to get at a conspicuously loose panel. He pried it open and ripped out as many wires as he could, burning his fingers in the process. He had to drag himself out from under it before it collapsed on top of him. From the sound of things, the central plaza was where most of the fighting was taking place. Deciding to take the higher road as he made his way over, he swung between the buildings and from the telephone poles. He dropped on top of a one-pointer that was aimed at one student's back, driving it into the ground. He was forced to dodge a two-pointer almost immediately that struck at him with its scorpion tail. Latching onto the tail with a scarf, he let himself be pulled toward the robot until he dropped on its back. There, he found another conveniently loose panel and pried out another set of wires. The robot dropped like a marionette with its strings cut. Suddenly, a rumbling louder than anything Izuku had ever heard filled the mock city, and a robot larger than the horizon appeared like everyone's worst nightmare. There was a moment of stillness as everyone stared up at the so-called gimmick of the test, because what were they supposed to do against that? Most people elected to run. Izuku was prepared to run himself when he heard a small cry of pain. He turned back to see the girl with the gravity quirk half buried in rubble near the foot of the approaching robot. There was no time to think, no time to dig her out before the robot was upon both of them. The only chance he had was to disable the robot where it stood. He was already running before he realized what he decided. The scarf unwound more than it usually did, stretching to latch onto the forward-reaching arm of the zero-pointer, then contracting like a rubber band to send him shooting towards the large head. A simple kick wasn't going to be enough to take it down, but there was exposed wiring around the joints. He aimed for the neck and started ripping as much out as he could, using his own body weight as leverage to knock the thicker cables loose. The robot started and shuddered before finally going eerily silent, leaving him hanging like a spider on its web from the head. Now that the danger was over, the departure of adrenaline was causing his body to crash hard. Slowly, as he was suddenly aware of how much his shoulders and arms ached, he lowered himself to the ground and picked his way across the rubble to the girl. He didn't even particularly care when President Mike announced that the exam was over. He started shifting the rubble away from the girl's legs until she could sit up and start pushing the concrete away herself. It aggravated the pain in his arms, but he wasn't about to make her wait for help when he was right there. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, exhaustion folding over him like a blanket. He had practiced endurance, strength, and speed, but never in such a dangerous scenario. Somehow going to school with Kachan had become less dangerous and more tedious, so an injection of real terror facing down a city full of rampaging robots was more than he'd been equipped to handle. "I'm fine," she replied, but winced as she shifted one of her feet. It had gotten scraped up quite a bit, and he wished he thought to carry around actual bandages rather than a scarf that resembled them rather strongly. "That's good. Because," he reasoned, if her foot was the worst of her injuries, she had escaped rather well off for the ordeal. An old woman hobbled her way through the crowd toward them, checking on the students she passed on her way. Even if Izuku hadn't been a Hero fanboy, he would have known about Recovery Girl. She had one of the strongest healing quirks in the world and was frequently held up as the reason why the entrance exam could be as hectic as it was. When a member of staff had the ability to heal injuries almost instantaneously, there wasn't a lot to be afraid of. "Now then," Recovery Girl said, settling in place and leaning on her cane. Who's hurt and in need of healing? Izuku pushed himself to his feet and offered an arm to the girl with the gravity quirk. Here, let me help you over. Thanks. The girl smiled. I'm Uraraka Ochalko, by the way. He smiled back. Midoriya Izuku. Nice to meet you. And thanks again for earlier. Uraraka looked back at the looming form of the zero-pointer. I think you've paid that back with a bit of interest. Izuku blushed, unsure what to say or do. How do you think you did? She asked when he didn't say anything. Terribly. I only had 12 points. She winced. Well, you saved me. That has to count for something, right? Izuku shrugged, then instantly regretted it as his shoulders reminded him that they were in pain. Through sheer effort, he suppressed the desire to flinch. It wasn't the worst thing he'd felt, after all, and it wasn't even the worst thing he'd done to himself. What have we here? Recovery girl asked as they approached. I swear, these exams get more dangerous every year. Here, sit down on the sidewalk, both of you. It's against my vows as a hero to let anyone leave wounded. She caught Izuku's arm. That includes you, young man. Don't think I don't recognize an injury when I see one. Uraraka turned on him immediately. You're hurt? And you are still helping me? It's not that bad. The blush was back, and if it hadn't hurt to raise his arms over his head, he would have covered his face as much as possible. I just sort of pulled my arms a bit. I'll be the judge of what's bad and what's not, young man, Recovery girl said, pushing him down next to Uraraka. I highly doubt you are the one in this conversation with a nursing degree. Not yet, he quipped. Then actually started putting some thought into things. But I think I could benefit from some first aid training. Recovery girl smiled. Then perhaps I'll see you in my elective class, should you make it into UA. It's nice to see budding young heroes acknowledge that there are more skills out there than punching people. She kissed Uraraka first, then him, and the instant relief in his shoulders was balanced by the sudden wave of fatigue that washed over him. There. Good as new. Take some gummy bears to get that energy back and sit here for as long as you need. I'm going to check on the other testing grounds. Izuku sighed, popping 2 of the gummy bears into his mouth and resisting the urge to just lie back on the cluttered and damaged sidewalk. I suppose if all else fails, I think I have a high enough written exam score to make it into Gen Ed. You shouldn't have to settle for that, though, Uraraka protested. You are a hero. You saved me, then I suppose it depends entirely on what the exam board thinks. Izuku shrugged. Whatever the case, I think I'll be okay if you say so. A strange look crossed her face. Look, it was nice meeting you, but I have something I need to go do. She stood up and waved. Thanks again for saving me. He nodded and sat there for a few minutes more, his arms resting on his knees and his head resting on his arms. 12 points. It was more than he would have gotten if he'd never found the capture scarf and never started training. He probably wouldn't have made it to the exam at all if he hadn't done things the way he had, and it was a nice dream to have, getting into UA through the heroics entrance exam. Now that the dream was over, he'd have to work hard enough to potentially make his way into the heroics department through the sports festival. After a few moments of self-pity, he picked himself up and left the testing ground to make his way home. An interesting crop of students we have this year, Nezu remarked, sipping on a cup of tea. Aizawa shouted just sighed as he reviewed the footage. A whole pack of problem children. Now, Shouta, pessimism is an admirable quality when exercised in moderation. But sometimes you take it too far. The diminutive principal smiled at him. Besides, I know there were a fair few that impressed you out there. Midoriya, for example. Shouta sighed again. Nezu made sure that was the moment the footage of Midoriya appeared back on his screen. He can think on his feet, I'll give him that. And for someone whose quirk doesn't have a lot of functionality against robots, he seemed to do pretty well. But he's reckless. On the contrary, what I see is someone determined to succeed, someone aware of his advantages and disadvantages who is not afraid to twist things in his favor. And running at the zero-pointer? How was that in his favor? Nezu tisked. You know as well as I do what that particular part of the test is for. When the danger appears insurmountable, it is the true measure of a hero to find a way to victory in the face of defeat. To stand and fight when the outlook appears most bleak. Shouta blinked. Gods above, he was too tired for this shit. You mean you're going to put him in my class? He frowned. Is this punishment? Look at it this way. You are the one best suited to take his raw potential and refine it into something outstanding. That wasn't a no. He bit back a groan because it wouldn't help. It would only make Nezu's stupid grin wider and push the headache he was nursing over into the vein of migraine. Truth be told, Midoriya probably wasn't the worst person he could get in his class. Bakugo Katsuki was, and as the student who got first place in the exam, he was automatically going to be Shouta's problem. As were most of the top 10, in fact. Midoriya was strange, however. Something about him set Shouta's senses on edge, and he'd learned to trust his gut in these matters. He didn't know what was going on, but it didn't seem bad, just weird. I'll get your class list to you once it's been finalized. I believe you've spent enough time going over this with me. Nezu took another sip of his tea. And I believe Yamada is waiting for you outside. He didn't groan. His husband didn't deserve that this time around, but he wanted to go to bed and Hisashi was going to want to talk, and he wasn't sure he was mentally prepared to deal with any of that. Shouta got up anyway and moved to the door. As expected, Hisashi was on the other side and seized his arm immediately, pulling him along toward the front gates. Please tell me we're going home, Shouta moaned. I want to sleep. You always want to sleep. Hisashi's tone was light and teasing, which meant he had picked up on how much Shouta didn't want to be in public at the moment. I love this man, he thought. God knows why he married me, but I love him. Interesting bunch of kids out there today, Hisashi murmured, keeping his voice low and even. Any favorites? Shouta frowned. I don't pick favorites. We both know that's not true. Deciding to be the better person, he didn't hit Hisashi. What about you? You always pick favorites. That Midoriya kid was good. Reminded me a bit of you, actually. Shouta frowned. No. You're not allowed to like the problem child. Then the last bit of what he said registered. Wait, what do you mean he reminded you of me? Hisashi shrugged. He's driven. And his quirk is a little bit like your capture scarf. He clearly trained with it for a long time in order to make everything look effortless and organic. He's a nervous little listener, though, like he doesn't have a lot of confidence in his ability to face others. Like how you first started out. Shouta did groan this time and buried his face in his husband's shoulder. He'd been an awkward and desperate kid, so quick to lash out because that's what he'd had to do to protect himself that it took Hisashi and Uboro months to get through to him. Even after that, he didn't really place a lot of trust in anyone else, which was why he still regularly worked himself to the bone or ended up in the hospital because he was too stubborn to call in backup for a situation he wasn't sure he could handle. You're going to jinx it, he moaned. He's going to be worse than I ever was, and that will be entirely your fault because you jinxed it. Or he could be better, Hisashi suggested, ever the optimist. You could teach him to be better. Bold of you to assume I know what I'm doing here, Shouta sighed. You really like this kid? Hisashi nodded and it meant more that he didn't say anything else. With a quirk like his, Hisashi was loud more often than he wasn't. He was on and open and utterly exhausting, but that was part of who he was. But they had learned together that it was in the moments he wasn't saying anything that he was at his most sincere. At some point, saying something aloud lost all meaning, but the intense and meaningful silence of a situation held more gravity than anything else. Okay then. Shouta knew he was going to have to get over things eventually. And he did have a begrudging respect for the kid doing what few others were willing to do in something as simple as the entrance exam. I suppose I can give the kid a chance. He did not blush when Hisashi kissed him. If his husband claimed otherwise, he was a rotten liar. Chapter 3 Notes. Can someone warn me next time that thanking the commenting community here means I'll get some of the most backhanded reviews ever on FF.net? Because those are a couple of reviews I wish I'd never seen. In other news, the demanding one who made me post this had a birthday recently, so late birthday gift, edgelord? It also made me look ahead and realize that if I can keep this or be posting something else on this schedule, I will be posting on my birthday, which would mark the day more than normal. Chapter text. Izuku was waiting for the letter that would tell him how badly he had failed the entrance exam. It had been a week since he took it and he had spent every spare moment second-guessing the decisions he had made. The only thing he couldn't bring himself to regret was saving Uraraka. He would have done that again, even if he somehow managed to half-kill himself in the process. Though upon reflection, he wondered if death hadn't been a real possibility. He probably looked like an idiot to the adjudicators, running at their gimmick and attempting to tear out as many wires as he could until something changed. If there was one reason that could explain why he wasn't going to get into the hero course, it would be how reckless he'd been and would be. A bunch of pro-heroes would definitely have picked up on that particular peculiarity of his. As the week had worn on, he was slowly coming to the realization that he wasn't as okay with the outcome as he tried to pretend he was. He had put in a lot of work to prepare for the entrance exam, he had gone in with some knowledge of what he was facing, and he still managed to freeze when it mattered. As much as he wanted to claim it was unfair, most of the other people in the exam hadn't let the situation stop them. Of course, they had actual quirks to back them up. They could trust in their abilities and didn't have to worry about accidentally exposing themselves as a fraud. Maybe it was better this way. He had told himself that he would explain the situation with the scarf to his mother if he got into the hero course, but he wasn't ready to admit that he'd been hiding something so big from her for the past 3 years. It was rude of him to do so and he didn't even really have a good excuse for it. Not getting into the hero course would give him a little while longer to get used to the idea of telling her and potentially figure out how to mention it without getting in trouble or making her needlessly upset with his apparent lack of trust. She patted his shoulder as she passed by him on the couch. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you, Izuku," she said, clearly able to tell that the events of last week were weighing on his mind. "You've come so far in so little time, and I know you can go so much further." He was really going to need to figure out a good way to explain everything. Just coming right out and saying it was sounding like a worse plan every time he thought of it. "I just wish the letter would arrive already, so I know one way or the other." He looked down at his hands. "I don't like having the possibility hanging over in my head like this." "Well, it should be coming soon, shouldn't it? It's been almost a week since the exams." Izuku nodded. "Then it might be in today's mail," his mother continued. "Wait just a few more hours and then you'll know for sure." A few hours spent just waiting sounded like the closest thing Izuku could conceive of as torture, so he went to his room and pulled up some of the latest footage of hero fights. He had figured out a while ago that his analysis was really the only real advantage he was going to have over his opponents. He couldn't assume he would always have his capture scarf on hand, and if he lost it, he needed something to fall back on. His notes lately tended more towards how to neutralize quirks, to fight them with something that gave them the same disadvantage he always suffered from. That wasn't to say he wasn't still figuring out ways people could use their quirks in creative ways. He usually started there, figuring out what the most effective method for using a quirk would be, then use that list to figure out how he could prevent each and every use with a method that was easy and accessible to use when he couldn't be sure of the materials he'd have access to. He couldn't assume he would always have access to water against a fire user, but he could probably find something to use as a large fan to manipulate the air currents and redirect the flames away from him. Most of his analysis pointed to shields being a useful tool to have and use in the field, as they could, depending on the material it's made out of, block a fair number of quirks. There was a reason he made notes about a durable shield of some sort to go with his hero costume, should he make it into the hero course. On his own, he intended to look up stronger, more cut-resistant materials to use to grow another scarf. They wouldn't be as useful as a shield, but given that he wore the scarf wrapped around his torso, he figured an extra layer of protection was nothing to belittle. Izuku had moved on to the footage of a battle that had taken place in downtown Tokyo less than an hour ago when his mother knocked on his door. She opened it a moment later, her eyes bright and shining as she held out an envelope with the UA insignia on it. Izuku suddenly couldn't breathe. The letter was here, and he would have his answer, and he wasn't sure now he wanted to open it. Mechanically, he reached to take it from her, feeling the strange weight of it as it dropped into his hand. His mother pushed the door open further and stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder as he tore it open carefully. As he was pulling out the letter, a small metal disc dropped onto his desk. It rolled to a stop and fell flat. Then, after a moment of silence as Izuku just stared at it, a light in the middle suddenly sprang to life. "Hello, listener," came the voice of Present Mike shortly before an image of him resolved in the light. Izuku let out an undignified squeak at the sight. "You made a good showing out in the field and collected 12 villain points. However, I am afraid this is not enough to qualify you for the hero course." Izuku's heart sank and he was glad his mother was there with him. He hadn't explained anything to her about the scars yet, but now he had time to figure out how to explain things. "If villain points were the only way of scoring in the test, that would be the end of our conversation. We had an interesting visitor in the observation booth shortly after the conclusion of the test, and I think you should see this." Behind Present Mike, a video appeared on a screen, showing a dimly lit room as the door opened. Uraraka appeared around it, looking at the faces on the other side of the camera. Excuse me?" she said, letting the door swing open the rest of the way. Midoriya Izuku, the plain-looking boy with green hair and the bandaged tentacle things. "He saved me, but he didn't get a lot of points. He could have been chasing after more robots, but he saved me, and I wanted to know if I could maybe share some of my points with him, because it isn't fair that he might not make it because of me." She frowned at them. "Heroes are supposed to save people, so he deserves to be in the hero course." In the video, Present Mike stepped forward from behind the camera and patted Uraraka's head. "I'm afraid we can't give him any of your points. But don't worry too much about the kid. He'll be fine." The other Present Mike in the projection turned back to face the camera. "Not only did you make a good showing for the adjudicators of the exam, you also impressed your fellow examinee with your selflessness." As she observed, being a hero isn't just about fighting villains, it's about saving people and standing up for what's right, and we would be a poor institution if we didn't recognize that. As such, we have a secret system known as rescue points. For your bravery and willingness to help save Uraraka-chan, you have been awarded 50 rescue points. This brings your total points up to 62 and puts you in 6th place overall in the exam. Congratulations, you now have a place in Class 1A. Welcome, Midoriya Izuku, to your Hero Academia. The projection shut off, but for several minutes Izuku could only gape at the disc. He had made it into UA. He had made it into the UA hero course. And he had done this while quirkless, not that anyone knew. A pair of arms wrapped around his shoulders from behind and he jolted before melting into his mother's hug. He was going to have to tell his mother about the scarves. There was no way around it at this point, and Uraraka had specifically mentioned them. "Mom," he whispered. "There's something I have to tell you." She pulled back enough that Izuku could turn his chair around to look at her. From her expression, he could tell she was concerned, which wasn't doing anything good for his anxiety. "What is it?" "They think I have a quirk." He decided to start there. It was honest and to the point and served as enough of a jumping-off point that he would be able to explain what he could. "They think I have a quirk and I'm going to let them continue thinking that." His mother moved back to sit on his bed. "Why do they think you have a quirk?" "It's sort of a long story." She patted the bed beside her, and he moved to sit next to her before launching into the full explanation. He told her about going out at night when he shouldn't have and finding Eraserhead's capture scarf. He told her about the research he had done into how it worked and whether it was safe. He even told her about the bullying and how everyone at school was convinced it was a quirk because he used it to escape from Kachon. This led into the admission that he let his teacher commit fraud for him since the man was so determined to register his quirk. She didn't look particularly happy about that bit, but Izuku was quick to point out the man hadn't done anything to help him when he believed, rightly so, that he was quirkless. It was petty and vindictive, but he refused to feel sorry for the man should the truth ever come out. Finally, he told her about the other scarves he had grown, opening his closet to show off the neatly folded finished varieties and the container that had yet another one in the process of growing. "Izuku," she murmured, reaching out for him as though she thought he might disappear or pull away from him. "You've done all this just to be a hero?" "I always wanted to be one, Mom. I never stopped wanting to be a hero. I intended to use the scarf in the entrance exam as soon as I figured out how to use it, but I never considered presenting it as my quirk until All Might mistook it for one. And then, because Ka-chan and his friends saw me use it to get away from them, they all thought it was a quirk too and took the decision out of my hands. He clenched his fists and stared at the ground, trying to find the right words. I just didn't want to be useless anymore. I knew I could do this. I knew I wanted to do this, and I knew I could figure out whatever I needed to make it work. He tried to smile, but even he could feel that it was turning out more manic than reassuring. Parkour, gymnastics, nanotechnology. I spent months researching and hypothesizing and trying to figure out how the scarf worked before I got around to trying this. He lifted up the still-growing scarf. If I could somehow alter the nanobots, I'd try other things, other configurations of scarves that would work a little differently. Izuku, I'm still proud of you. She stepped closer and wrapped him in a hug so tight it brought tears to his eyes. That was the only reason he was crying, honest. More even, now that I know how much work you've put in for this. I don't think I can understand half of what you've managed to do, but I know it's incredible. And I'm sorry for not believing in you when you needed me. I'm sorry I couldn't have supported you more or protected you. No, Mom, it's fine. He choked on the words, unable to find a way to articulate how much even the slightest support she had offered had meant to him. She had never abandoned him for his lack of quirk, had never let her love for him become conditional, gated behind something so unattainable as manifesting a quirk out of the ether. She was the best part of his day for years because she cared for him more than anyone else dared to. So instead of trying to use words, he just held her, crying into her shoulder as she hugged him back and cried into his. They stayed there for a while, until Izuku's head started to ache from the crying. He was glad he'd told her. Yes, it was necessary for her to know what to expect when people talked about his quirk, but it was also cathartic to have it out in the open, to admit to picking up Eraserhead's capture scarf and using it to join the hero course. It was such a big part of his life that lying to her for years had been difficult, even painful at times. Now she knew and he felt like he could float away for lack of the weight of it. For the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he was finally free of the secrets he'd been holding back out of fear. They celebrated his acceptance into Class 1A with Katsudon, and Izuku was willing to swear it was the best meal he'd eaten in years. His mother just smiled and took the compliment. The first day of high school arrived and a thick knot of nerves in his gut had kept him awake most of the night. Part of his fears were irrational, he knew. No one knew that he was technically quirkless. No one but his mother. That didn't stop him from waking up from a nightmare where the faceless homeroom teacher stopped him at the door and demanded he leave because he was dragging down the reputation of the school with his very presence. The nightmare had continued with his scarf strangling him, dragging him down into a deep pit filled with something thick and oozing. It was getting in his mouth and choking him, and people were just standing and watching as he struggled. His scarf had gone limp when he tried to use it, and All Might himself was standing nearby and loudly lamenting that such a promising young hero was really nothing but a fraud. The familiar chant started up from the crowd, everyone talking about how it was only right that he dies because wasn't that what quirkless people were supposed to do. He woke up choking, hardly able to breathe, and his capture scarf was lashing around on the end of the bed where he'd left it when he went to sleep. He reached for it and it reached back for him, slithering up under his pajamas and wrapping itself around him. The familiar feel of it against his skin was comforting, not like the dream scarf which had let him die. The ooze, he knew, was from the slime villain All Might had saved him from. Telling his mother about it had brought back the terror that had been so easily undercut by his shock at the hero's assumption of his scarf being part of a quirk. His mind had moved on in the moment, but apparently his subconscious hadn't. He had heard a few things about imposter syndrome, but could he have that if he were actually an imposter? The capture scarf technically wasn't his, even though he had made it his own over the years, and he knew he wouldn't have made it into UA without it. What was to say his dream was going to become reality? All the teachers at UA were pro-heroes. They could probably look at him and be able to tell that he didn't actually have a quirk. Then he would get in trouble for faking it, for making out that he was something other than what he was. Would he go to prison for faking a quirk? Or would it just go on some permanent record he'd never be able to expunge? Would people point and laugh at him, saying that's the worthless, quirkless kid who tried to be a hero and lied his way into UA? All he had ever wanted in his life was to be a hero. Now he had his chance, but it felt like it could be ripped away from him at any moment. Even knowing he was going to fight with everything he had to keep his dream alive, part of him insisted he be ready for the moment it all started to fall apart. When his mother knocked on his door to wake him up, she found him already up and dressed and sitting at his desk with a new notebook filled with feverish writing. "Izuku?" His head shot up, glancing around for a moment before his eyes settled on her and he relaxed. "Yes, it's time for breakfast." She looked between the notebook and him. "How long have you been up?" Izuku rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. "I'm not sure exactly. I couldn't sleep." He stood and stretched before following her out to the kitchen table. "I suppose it's good you're up early," his mother said after a while. "I had something I wanted to talk to you about." Izuku froze. In his experience, at least where other people were concerned, those words never meant anything good. He couldn't think of anything he'd forgotten to do around the house that would make his mom say them, but if he'd forgotten something, he couldn't exactly remember what he'd forgotten, could he? "Yes, it's nothing bad." "Well, it might be, but that's what I wanted to talk to you about." She set her chopsticks aside and looked at him. "Mitsuki called me the other day and said that Katsuki was going to be in class 1A. Apparently, he was the top scorer for the exam. I didn't tell her you'd made it into the class, too, but all I could think about was what you told me about him." Izuku frowned. It had honestly slipped his mind that Kachan was going to be there, too. There had never really been any doubt in his mind that his childhood friend would pass the exam and be in the best class, but knowing and understanding that were two vastly different things. And then there was the fact that he had explained everything about how his relationship with his old friend had deteriorated almost instantly after they found out he was quirkless. That was yet another thing he had lied to his mother about over the years, and she hadn't been happy when she'd heard it. He'd barely managed to stop her from storming over to the Bakugo house to yell at him. This conversation was apparently the natural consequence of that. "Izuku, I want you to avoid him as best you can. And if you can't, I want you to tell your teacher about the history between you two." There was no room for denial or questioning in her voice. And Izuku could appreciate that if he weren't on the worst side of it at the moment. "You told me that all the teachers there are pro-heroes. As such, they should take such a threat to the well-being of their students seriously. If that proves false, I want you to come to me and I will deal with it." His mother had once mentioned she considered law school as a possible option for her future. She had decided to become a nurse instead, but there was a reason she considered it. For all their displays of emotions, both he and his mother were intelligent enough to understand and manipulate where they stood in the eyes of society. It was harder for Izuku to manage most of the time, but he had left school with no permanent marks on his disciplinary record in spite of what some teachers tried, and most of the time he didn't even need to call in his mother to manage it. There was only so far educational authority stretched, and if nothing were going to be noted on the records of the others involved, they couldn't pin every incident on him. Kachan was never present for the conversations that happened regarding how to spin things, but he would have blown up at the teachers instead if they tried to make out in their reports that he was the victim in that situation. Fortunately, they recognized the slippery slope they were on and backed off. Quirkless or not, fights had at least two sides to them, and pinning everything on Izuku simply wouldn't hold up. If anything, putting all his aggressors down as victims would have been a glowing recommendation for any combat-oriented position, as it would appear he could abuse his classmates in spite of their powers. "He's probably going to try something," Izuku told her. "If for no other reason than he's used to getting his way. UA is a new environment, but he spent 3 years able to do whatever he wanted to me because no one was speaking up about it. More, if you add in elementary school, I don't think he knows how to not attack me, even though he's been pretty quiet since I escaped out the window using my scarf. He just ignored me then. I don't think he even considered that I might be able to get into UA on my own." His mother huffed. "That's all the more reason to tell your teachers. And perhaps you should stop calling him by the name you used as a child." He doesn't deserve your familiarity as much as you don't deserve his abuse. She sat up straighter and fixed him with a look he rarely saw on her face. It pinned him in place like a moth in a lepidopterist's study. I will be asking about your day this evening and you will answer me truthfully. Yes, Mom, he said, ducking his head in acknowledgement. Truth be told, he didn't want to find out what would happen if he refused or lied. Probably nothing good. Good. Now, do you have everything you need? Your school ID, the campus map they send, your supplies? He lifted his backpack, which had been leaning against the leg of his chair as he ate. I've got everything. She smiled, her eyes a little watery from the effort of holding back tears. Excellent. Be safe. I'll do my best. And it did hurt just a little bit to know that was all he could promise her. But with Kacha and Bakugo, he should get used to that. With Bakugo there wasn't much he could do. The whole experience hinged directly on whether or not their teacher was going to let his behavior go or deal with it. She stood and followed him to the door, kissing him on the forehead while he put on his shoes. I love you and I'm proud of you, Izuku. Never doubt that. The warm feeling of validation, so foreign to him, welled up in his chest. He knew she would rather he pursue a safer career. She saw enough heroes brought into the hospital during her shifts, even though she didn't work down an emergency. She understood how dangerous the job was. But he knew it too, and he was still willing to take those risks. He also knew she would support him in that as she had in everything else. With one last smile over his shoulder, he started out, mildly hopeful for the first time in a long time. Chapter 4 Notes. Thank you for all of your support. And now, the chapter many of you have been anticipating. Our poor anxious boy get to meet Eraserhead when he's least prepared to deal with it. You evil giggle. Chapter text. Izuku stopped being quite as certain about things as soon as he stepped through the school gates. It wasn't crowded by any means, not in the same way it had been during the entrance exam, but there were a lot of people he didn't know around. What was more, he could feel them sizing him up with their eyes, categorizing all the little ticks he displayed and evaluating whether he was worth their time or not. So far, he could tell the answer was no. Which wasn't all that different from the entrance exam either, as everyone on the testing field had written him off with their eyes almost immediately. He pulled out the campus map and used it to navigate his way towards classroom 1A. It wasn't long before he was standing in front of one of the largest doors he'd ever seen. I suppose that makes sense, he muttered to himself as he reached for the handle. They need to accommodate for all sorts of quirks and body types. He was greeted by noise the instant he opened the door. Half of it was Bakugo. The other person was the boy with glasses from the entrance exam who got upset with Izuku's mumbling. He must have murdered somebody important in a past life to be this unlucky now. Don't put your legs on the desk. Don't you think that's disrespectful to your classmates? The boy with glasses demanded. No, I don't think so, Bakugo replied. Which middle school are you from anyway, extra? Izuku couldn't help but think back on what he said to his mother before he left and how apparently he didn't even need to be there for Bakugo to try something straight out of middle school. That was exactly how Bakugo always sat at his desk and the teacher never said a word about it. Nor did anyone else. And the fact he was still calling people extras was a perfect example of how much respect he had for his classmates, most of whom took the exact same exam and got in on their own merits. He didn't respect anyone who wasn't him or hadn't beaten him in a fight. And since Izuku had never seen Bakugo lose a fight, he didn't respect anyone. He tried to skirt around the argument, spying his name on the desk directly behind Bakugo. The motion, however, seemed to catch the eye of the boy with glasses, and he shuffled over. Hello. I am Mitatanya from Same Junior High School. Izuku could feel every eye in the room turn to him like a persistent itch all over his body. One glance was particularly heated, and he knew that if looks could kill, he would be dead where he stood. The fuck are you doing here, Deku? Bakugo demanded. Izuku opened his mouth to answer, but he wasn't quite sure what to say. Bakugo would probably take any answer he gave as something snarky, and thus count it as a reason to attack him. He looked between Ida and Bakugo and decided on the lesser of two evils. I'm Midoriya Izuku, he said, bowing slightly to Ida. Nice to meet you, Midoriya. Hi. came a voice from behind him and he turned to see Uraraka grinning at him and waving. "I'm glad you got in. I'm glad you're here, too. Thank you for speaking to the adjudicators on my behalf." He reached up to rub the back of his neck. "They showed me a recording in my acceptance video." Uraraka's cheeks turned bright red. "Oh, of course. Anything for a friend. And they gave me rescue points for doing that, too, which is how I got in." "If you're only here to make friends, you might as well leave now." Izuku jumped, as did about half the class, when a strange human-sized yellow caterpillar spoke. Everyone watched in morbid fascination as the thing crept over to the teacher's desk, stood, and turned so they saw its very human face. Then it unzipped itself from its cocoon and the breath caught in Izuku's throat as a person stepped out of it. He knew exactly who this was, if only for the scarf wrapped around the man's neck. Eraserhead. The scarf around his chest and arms was suddenly feeling very stolen, in spite of the fact he'd found it abandoned in an alley. After 3 years, he was confident that none of the nanobots in his scarf were aligned with Eraserhead anymore and hadn't been since at least 6 months after he picked it up. But Izuku couldn't help feeling like everything was going to fall apart as soon as Eraserhead saw the scarf. The phrase "borrowed time" was jangling around in his head, and the only thing that was keeping him rooted in place was his anxiety. And the knowledge that he had more scarves if Eraserhead tried to take this one away. This was not how he wanted to meet his hero. This was a nightmare scenario, worse than his mind had or could have conjured. Of course, that was how he knew he was unfortunately, unrepentantly awake. This wasn't something he knew he needed to be afraid of an hour ago, and suddenly it was the center of his world. He only hoped that the rest of the people in the room were managing to draw enough of Eraserhead's attention that he wouldn't notice the instant panic attack Izuku was experiencing. The underground hero cast his eyes across the room full of frozen and perplexed students. "It took you 8 seconds to quiet down. That's 8 seconds you and I won't get back. Out in the field, time like that is the difference between saving someone's life and retrieving their corpse." The atmosphere in the room dimmed. Izuku slipped into the desk behind Bakugo, putting his backpack on the floor next to his chair and praying that this day wasn't going to go as horribly as he was expecting it to. "My name is Aizawa Shouta. I am to be your homeroom teacher." He reached into his cocoon sleeping bag and produced a set of gym clothes. "Put these on and meet me out on the PE grounds." Everyone seemed to have his words about time on the mind as they dressed as quickly as possible and raced out to the field. Aizawa-sensei watched as they approached, none of them running, but moving as something more than a leisurely stroll. He didn't pay a lot of attention to anyone in particular, but Izuku's heart still stopped when Aizawa's eyes paused on him. "Good. You're here. Now you're going to do a Quirk apprehension test." Izuku felt the first bubble of nerves explode in his gut. A Quirk apprehension test, and he was only playing at having a quirk. At least Aizawa didn't say anything about the scarf. He didn't even appear to recognize it, despite having a copy wrapped around his own neck. Though maybe that had something to do with the differences in how they wore it openly. On Aizawa, the capture scarf looked a bit like an actual scarf. Around Izuku's arms, it looked like thick bandages, which neatly covered up the scars he had collected from the bullying he'd suffered over the years. That would have caused a lot of questions. More than the capture scarf perhaps, though not by much. "Bakugo. You got first in the entrance exam. Come up here, please." Bakugo slouched his way up to Aizawa, offering a disinterested stare at anyone and everyone, including the teacher. From the way Aizawa-sensei had stilled, he wasn't impressed with the attitude, but he wasn't going to say anything about it. Izuku wasn't liking the chances that things would be different from middle school. If their teacher wasn't about to say anything about the obvious disrespect to his face, why would he do anything if Bakugo decided to fall back into attacking Izuku? As much as he wanted to have faith in one of his favorite heroes, Eraserhead was a teacher here, and teachers had never offered him any sort of real help when Bakugo attacked. "How far was your softball throw in middle school?" Bakugo scoffed. 67 meters. "Now try it with your quirk." There was a sort of vindictive fire in Bakugo's eyes at the invitation to use his quirk in such a way. He grabbed the softball from Aizawa-sensei's hand and stepped into the circle. He wound up, putting his whole body into the throw. He boosted it with an explosion as it left his hand with a scream of die. Izuku, meanwhile, was having violent flashbacks to middle school and elementary school when he had been the softball, and part of him wasn't sure if Bakugo actually meant what he was saying. He never asked because he was afraid the answer would be yes. Aizawa-sensei held up the sensor, which read 705.2 meters. It's important for us to know our limits, he explained. That's the first logical step to figuring out what sort of heroes you'll be. Izuku was mentally running over the sort of tests they had done before, trying to figure out how he was supposed to be able to include the capture scarf in that. Especially how to use it in ways that didn't immediately out it as a capture scarf. Pretending it was a bunch of prehensile fabric he could control like an extra limb was all well and good, but it didn't change the fact that this was the exact function of a capture scarf. Attempting to use it in the same way around its original owner was going to get him caught. And he didn't have the nice loophole about bringing whatever he wanted to this test. Around him, he was vaguely aware of his classmates muttering excitedly about being able to utilize their quirks for the test. "You think this is fun?" Aizawa said suddenly, pulling Izuku out of his thoughts. "You have 3 years to prove that you can be heroes and you think this is fun? All right then." He straightened and fixed them all with a serious look. "How about we make this a little more fun? The person who scores the lowest on these tests will be expelled." He grinned at them and Izuku was inclined to say the expression looked downright sadistic. "Welcome to UA's hero course." "Expelled?" Uraraka exclaimed. "But that's not fair. The world we live in is inherently unfair. Villain attacks, natural disasters, traffic accidents. It's our job as heroes to correct the unfairness." Aizawa-sensei brushed the hair out of his eyes. "If you can't do anything about that unfairness in a simple test, you probably shouldn't be a hero." There were still a few grumbles from the group, people who weren't happy with the extra condition, but Izuku knew better than anyone how unfair the world could be. He was living proof that sometimes the world wasn't fair no matter what you tried to do about it. Everything he had done since picking up the capture scarf had been an attempt to make life just a little bit fairer for himself, and he would probably fight harder than anyone else here to keep his position. Everyone else had quirks, after all. They didn't have nearly as much to lose. And it wouldn't matter if he were in last place if Eraser had figured out that Izuku was wearing and using one of his scarves. If he was figured out here, he was going to be expelled and there was no way around it. Which meant he wasn't allowed to fail here. He wasn't allowed to be found out, no matter what. The capture scarf didn't belong to Eraserhead anymore, and Izuku had put too much work into this to go home now. Determination burned in his gut alongside the constant quiver of desperation. He had thought the entrance exam was the biggest hurdle on the road to becoming a hero. But he was starting to see that it was only the first. It was going to be a long 3 years if threats of expulsion came with every exercise, but he refused to give up. The first test was the 50-meter dash, which they were running in pairs. There wasn't anything nearby Izuku could grip to pull himself along, except perhaps Bakugo, and that wouldn't really end well for him. It could, however, get him in trouble like it would have back in middle school. So he wasn't willing to even try it. Instead, he went for a full tilt sprint, imagining that he was being chased by bullies again. He was partially thwarted by Bakugo, who used his explosions to propel him forward. Izuku tripped as the explosion blinded him momentarily, and it was only with instincts honed by parkour and gymnastics that he turned his stumble into a forward roll before bouncing back up to his feet. 6.47 seconds. The robot at the end of the track chirped. He could be happy with that. It was a full second faster than he'd been in middle school. The second test was grip strength, and the only test he really had any plan for. Part of the capture scarf slipped down his arm to wrap around the handle beside his hand. He clenched tighter and tighter, focusing the extent of his physical strength and the pressure of the capture scarf together. He knew the grip of the capture scarf was considerable, especially since it wasn't bound by physical limits and he used it to grip and climb all the time. His mastery of that simple task was the first thing he had pursued other than accuracy. The device beeped, reading 262 kilograms. Not the best in the class. That went to a guy with multiple arms, but not the worst either. He turned when he felt eyes on him and managed to catch Aizawa-sensei staring. which wasn't unnerving at all. It only sent his heart into his throat at Mach 4. Whatever Aizawa was thinking, though, he didn't say it. Izuku couldn't tell if that was good or bad yet. History said bad, but he was still hopeful that Yue would be different. He'd probably still be hopeful up to the moment they kicked him through the gate and told him never to come back. For the standing long jump, he tried something different, something that didn't seem like what a person could or should do with a capture scarf at all. Unwrapping the ends of the scarf from his arms, he let it coil underneath him in a rough sort of spring. He jumped and tried to use the scarf to throw himself that much further forward. It wasn't as successful as he hoped it would be, but he got about half a meter further than he was expecting to go, which he counted as a win. He would need a lot more practice on the ground with it before he tried to incorporate the move in parkour, but he was starting to actually get somewhere with it. At the very least, maybe it would make Aizawa forget whatever he was thinking about the scarf. The sidestepping test was exhausting, but he tried to do the same thing as the long jump. It was about as ineffective as before, but Izuku made a mental note to add that specific exercise with his practice as it forced him to try the spring coil over and over again. He'd need that if he were going to try and make it second nature. The softball throw was next. He wasn't going to be able to throw as far as Bakugo, but trying to beat his childhood friend and bully at anything was an exercise in futility or pain. Or both. Fortunately, he hadn't been anywhere nearby when Izuku reported the numbers for the grip test, as he probably would have exploded in more ways than one. Izuku lifted the ball and let the end of the capture scarf wrap around it. Then, swinging the now weighted down scarf around in circles beside him, he released the ball on an upswing when it would have the most lateral movement. Aizawa held out the sensor so he could see the bright 139.4 meters it displayed. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but apparently decided against it. The silence sent another frisson of anxiety shooting through Izuku's body. He wanted to scream in the man's face and demand to know what he wanted, but that would probably just get him expelled. So Izuku met Aizawa's silence with silence of his own. Eventually one of them would crack. It was probably going to be Izuku, but at least he could have the satisfaction of saying he'd been brought to his absolute breaking point in the process. He wasn't going to give the man anything less, if only to prove a point. There wasn't much he could do with the scarf for the endurance running, but he definitely relied on it for upper body training exercises, taking over some of the weight during the pull-ups and the hanging bar crunches. Which wasn't demonstrate that he couldn't do them without the scarf, just that it was wonderful to fall back on it when he was starting to reach the limits of his physical body. Surely part of the test was proving how one's quirk could help them surpass those limits safely. Or, in his case, Quirk. The last test was seated toe touches, and Izuku wrapped the ends of the capture scarf around the bottoms of his shoes to pull himself into a deeper stretch, being mindful of the limit between difficult and painful. He could feel Aizawa-sensei's eyes on him like a simmering burn on his back, and he wondered if the man had figured him out now. He hadn't said anything, but the man saw his capture scarf in action every single day. Wearing it differently or using it in non-traditional ways wasn't going to change what it was. Not really. This was it, wasn't it? Aizawa was going to expose him to the entire class for not having a quirk, turning everybody against him, and then he was going to be expelled, disgraced, and probably arrested. It probably wouldn't end with just expulsion because he lied about having a quirk and he had kept Eraserhead's capture scarf for more than 3 years at this point. There would be some kind of legal action for that, surely. That would ruin his chances of ever becoming a hero and would probably put him on some kind of list. There was probably also some law about faking a quirk or something that he hadn't known about before. It wasn't like he bothered to look up the legal matters of quirks and quirk registration before he filled out the sheet for his old homeroom teacher. The anxiety bubbled up in his gut until he felt his throat seize up. It took conscious effort not to throw up, and he hoped he didn't look as bad as he felt. He was second-guessing every decision he had made on the field, every little thing he had done with the capture scarf. What if he had used it to latch onto Bakugo during the 50-meter dash? That would have been too much like how Eraserhead used it. What if he had practiced that spring before today, or if he had attempted to bury the ends of the scarf in the sand pit to fling himself forward in the standing long jump? What if there was a more effective way of slingshotting the softball for the throwing test that he hadn't thought of? Aizawa must have tried something like that before. That could be the moment he ruined everything for himself. That could be the moment he failed his dreams, and he only had himself to blame. On the other hand, what if Izuku made Aizawa angry using the scarf in a way he'd never used it before? Teachers didn't like to be corrected in their own subject, and wearing the capture scarf to school and using it as his quirk was like spitting in the man's face, wasn't it? The scarf tightened around his ribs and he was grateful for the comfort, however fleeting that might be. He still had the scars at home, so he could fall back on that if he were expelled. Maybe he could become a vigilante so he could still help people? There were programs that even legitimized vigilantes after a while. Ingenium had one of the more successful ones running out of his agency, Ida 10. Izuku blinked, a connection forming in his mind, and he glanced over at Ida, who looked quite a bit like Ingenium and even shared a name with him. He was so shocked by this realization that he forgot momentarily the inevitability of his impending doom. The anxiety came right back once Aizawa-sensei spoke. "Your total scores represent your performance in each test," he told them, holding a small remote. "Don't ask me to explain the ranking process, as that would take far too much time, and I believe I've made my feelings on that matter clear." Izuku tensed, unsure where he would fall in the rankings. Probably at the bottom. Eraserhead could erase quirks, which meant he could probably tell whether or not someone was using a quirk. Which could mean he knew Izuku hadn't used a quirk that whole time. The bottom fell out of his stomach and he wished the ground would open up beneath him and swallow him whole. "Oh," Aizawa said, "Mineta, you should be grateful I was lying about expelling the person who came last. Take this as a chance to be better. You have potential and you shouldn't waste it trying to chase things that don't matter right now." Mineta, the short boy with the purple balls instead of hair, sobbed in relief. His name was at the very bottom of the list, not Izuku's. Izuku had forgotten how to breathe. There were 20 places on the rankings and 20 students in the class, and somehow his name wasn't at the bottom of the list. Working up from there, he found his own name comfortably placed at 16. Right after the guy with the tape dispensers at his elbows. Unlike the capture scarf, he could actually adhere to surfaces to pull himself along, and he didn't seem to be constrained by a length limit. Aizawa wasn't expelling him. He wasn't expelling anyone, to be fair, but he wasn't expelling Izuku, and he apparently didn't recognize the scarf. Or he did and he just wasn't saying anything. The emotional whiplash he was experiencing was exhausting. He wanted to ride the euphoria of not getting discovered and expelled, but new and more troubling questions were starting to filter into his brain. How long until the next test that could get him discovered or thrown out? Was Aizawa aware that Izuku was using his capture scarf, and, if so, did he care? Was he going to grab Izuku after school and demand answers? Was he giving Izuku just enough rope to hang himself with by not calling him out in front of everyone? Was the rest of the world really so stupid that they thought someone capable of being a hero had to have a quirk? If he had faked a quirk years ago, would his life have been better? Was he going to have to keep up this faking his whole life? The last question stopped him in his tracks. He added find a way to alter the scarf's base design to his mental to-do list. Because if he was going to try and keep this charade going his whole life, he was going to need to establish some variety in his future capture scarves. This moved programming and researching nanotechnology up the list as well. Considering he had to accomplish that on top of school, he was starting to wish he did have a quirk, one that could pause or bend time and give him more hours in the day to work with. He didn't doubt he could handle the level of work he had picked up for himself. But the hours of sleep he was going to lose over everything were actually not as bad as what he normally lost to the hellish cocktail of insomnia, anxiety, panic, and pain. He was still in a class with Bakugo, and he was still going to keep up his intense workout routine that included a near-daily run to and from Dagoba Beach. Pain was not going away anytime soon. Anxiety was an old friend and panic was its twin. Insomnia came for free, so everything was going to stay exactly the same while being completely different. He was going to die. "Anyway, we're done here," Aizawa-sensei said, turning away. "You'll find the syllabus for the course in the classroom." Once Racerhead was out of sight, Izuku felt some of the tension melt out of him. He really didn't recognize the capture scarf at all, did he? After so long, did he remember losing it? If he did, surely he wouldn't have expected a student to make it into the hero course with it. A quirkless student, no less. While he couldn't bring himself to be completely reassured by this possibility, Izuku could be cautiously optimistic and see where that got him from there. As he was changing out of his gym clothes and back into the school uniform, he wondered if the records they had access to would note the change in his Quirk registration. Did they know he only had his Quirk registered for about 10 months, or did they assume that it came in around the same time as everyone else's would have? Nothing had been said, and he earned his place in the class, so he assumed they thought he was no different from the other prospective heroes around him. What would they think of him if they knew? The rest of the day was normal by comparison, with the first session of regular classes just to get the syllabus and see what sort of work they had to look forward to for the rest of the semester. By the time the end of the day arrived, Izuku was more than ready to go home, where the threat of discovery was far less immediate. Considering all of the teachers who worked with Eraserhead, it might only take one of them noticing how similar his quirk was to the scarf around Eraserhead's neck. He was glad the scarf was easily and effectively hidden under his uniform, just like it always was. He was walking into the gate, intent on going home, when a heavy hand landed on his shoulder. He flinched, expecting to turn around and see Kachan or Aizawa behind him. Instead, it was Ida. "You have excellent control of your quirk," he said. "Pardon my asking, but it was unclear. Is it a mutation or an emitter-type quirk?" "Oh, it's not a mutation," Izuku explained. "I can just control it." Which wasn't a lie. He didn't say it was a quirk, but Ida was free to infer what he wished from that. "And you have clearly spent a lot of time working to control it as you do." Izuku nodded. "When I first started using it, I couldn't grip anything tightly. Except myself." He rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. "I kept getting tangled up in it and had to figure out how to get free on my own." "Oh, hey, Midoriya." Izuku turned to see Uraraka running after the two of them. Ida nodded to himself. "The Infinity Girl." "Yeah, I'm Uraraka." "Oh, Choco. You're Ida Tenya, right? I met Midoriya at the entrance exam when he saved me from the zero-pointer. I was in that testing ground as well." Ida turned to look at Izuku. "I am ashamed that I did not suss out the hidden portion of the test until after it was concluded." No," Izuku said, waving his hands frantically. "I didn't know there were rescue points until after my letter came. Someone needed to help, and I was right there. My feet moved on their own." He could remember the half-blind panic of the moment, throwing himself at the zero-pointer with only the thought that if he tore out enough wires it would stop. "Until the letter arrived, I honestly thought I failed because I only got 12 points. What you did at the exam was still pretty brave, Midoriya." Uraraka sped up until they were all walking side by side. No one else was going to fight it. "I wasn't really fighting. I was trying to rip out as many important wires as I could find." He shrugged. "Honestly, it probably would have worked better if a lot of people got together to take it down. They have rescue points. Do you suppose they have cooperation points too?" "Perhaps," Ida replied. "Being able to work with fellow heroes is an important part of becoming a hero. However, when focused on one's individual desire to pass the exam, I don't know whether anyone would listen. Especially since the target wasn't worth any points. Still, it would have been cool to see a whole exam site come together to take one down, wouldn't it?" Izuku tried to imagine it happening with the quirks he'd seen in the apprehension test. All those interesting and useful quirks working to accomplish the same goal? "If I were a teacher, especially a hero teacher, I'd want to see that in an exam." "That would be cool," Uraraka agreed. "Maybe if we ever have to fight them again, we could try that. I think we could convince most of the class to help with that." She frowned suddenly. "Midoriya, why did that one boy call you Deku? I know you told me your name was Izuku." "That's Kachan. I mean, Bakugo Katsuki. We grew up together and Deku is just a horrible name he always called me. He liked it because it means useless because he thought I was useless because of my quirk. Or lack thereof," he added mentally. "Oh, I thought it sounded kind of like Dekiru, but that's not very nice at all." Why do you call him Kachan if he calls you that? Izuku shrugged. Force of habit? I'm trying to stop. I promised my mom I would, but it's only been a day and I've been calling him that my entire life, he sighed. Bakugo would probably rather die than compliment me at this point, and I don't think I would want him to. I wouldn't be able to believe he was sincere about it. I'm honestly surprised he hasn't tried to turn me into a charred and bloody smear on the pavement yet. Uraraka winced. It's that bad? Sounds a bit like some of the girls I knew at my middle school. Except for them it wasn't quirks. Well, it was kind of about quirks, but it was also about money. They never did anything directly, but if something happened, everyone knew they were somehow involved, and no one could do anything about it because the leader of their group was the principal's daughter. How shameful, Ida exclaimed, gesticulating robotically. As an educator, especially as the head educator of their school, they should have been treating the situation with the same level of gravity as if it were any other student. Izuku thought about all of the teachers who looked the other way when someone was being hurt. He thought about Kirigaya-sensei, who never bothered to do anything until it seemed like Izuku had a quirk, and then he became the most helpful person, filing registration forms about a fake quirk Izuku definitely didn't have. That's just the way the world works sometimes, Ida, he said, feeling more tired than the quirk assessment test had any right to make him. Like Aizawa-sensei said, the world is unfair and it's up to us as heroes to make it a little fairer. Are heroes allowed to intervene in schools like that? Uraraka wondered. I mean, obviously the heroes are our teachers this time, but what about other schools, places that don't have heroes working for them? Can we go in and stop something if we know something is going wrong? Perhaps this is something we should discuss with Aizawa-sensei tomorrow, Ida put in as they arrived at the station. Of anyone we have access to, he would be in the best position to know. Right. We'll have to do that then. Uraraka smiled and it lit up her whole face. Now, could I get both of your phone numbers? I have to catch my train home, but I want to continue this conversation. And we're friends, aren't we? It was such a simple thing to tack on to the end of what she was saying, but Izuku couldn't ignore it. Part of him was guilty, a little voice whispering that they only wanted to be friends with him because they thought he had a quirk. But the rest of him was desperate to enjoy the feeling while he had it. He hadn't been friends with anyone since Bakugo found out he was quirkless. No one would talk to him or listen to him without having some ulterior motive. He didn't think Uraraka was just offering to be nice. She seemed like a genuine sort of person, someone who honestly wanted the best for the people she knew. So, he typed his number into her phone with a smile and pushed away some of the lingering doubts about whether or not she was doing this to pity him. He did the same for Ida, who was less terrifying when their futures weren't on the line. And the bright sparking feeling deep in his gut, he thought that might just be hope. He couldn't wait to tell his mom about his day. Chapter 5 Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Izuku was feeling better about going to school the next day, knowing that he would have Ida and Uraraka to talk to. They had spent a while texting back and forth about what life was like in middle school, though Izuku edited a lot of the stories he told about his school experiences, not sure how much he wanted to tell them about himself. The fact that most of the bullying was because he was quirkless didn't make the conversation, and neither Uraraka nor Ida asked about it. He refused to tell them too much about Bakugo's involvement in everything, but he thought they were smart enough to guess a few things. Bakugo had made it clear from the very beginning that he didn't follow anyone or anything. He wasn't going to hop on to bullying one kid just because everyone else was doing it, but he was far more likely to be the instigator. Izuku's mother was thrilled to hear that he'd made a couple of friends. He told her about his day, as promised, mentioning that other than when he first entered the classroom, he and Bakugo didn't even interact. Honestly, he wished he would say or do something. Izuku was on edge waiting for the eventual explosion, and that was always worse than the explosion itself. Maybe Bakugo knew that Izuku was holding that history over him. Maybe he was biding his time, waiting for an opportunity where their new teachers, heroes who might actually care about his actions, weren't around to see. He got to the classroom and made his way to his seat, distantly glad he was there earlier than the day before. Bakugo hadn't arrived yet and Izuku relished having the moment to settle and prepare himself for everything. It was the first actual day of classes, and he was both excited and nervous for everything. According to their schedules, they had normal classes in the morning and the afternoons were reserved for heroics classes. He was a little disappointed that the regular schedule didn't include science classes for the hero course, as science had routinely been his best subject in school. There was something about science, about being able to observe and draw inferences, that came easily to him. He had trained it alongside his analysis, and now he had much more knowledge to draw on, many more conclusions and hypotheses to test. It was just a shame he wouldn't have that in a classroom setting this time around. There were several clubs available though, and he was looking into the programming club to see if he could learn some of what he needed to know to modify the capture scarf design. That he would also be in the vicinity of the support labs and all the students studying there was just icing on the cake for him. Things finally seemed like they were coming together into something he could understand and plan for. It all sort of hit him at once that he was in UA, and the future he had dreamed of, the future he'd been ridiculed and abused for wanting his whole life, was actually within reach. He hadn't gotten expelled in the Quirk apprehension test even though he didn't have a quirk to use, and he had made friends for the first time since he was 4. He didn't cry, but it was a near thing, the swell of emotion hitting him like one of Bakugo's explosions. Against the odds, in spite of everyone who told him to give up, he was sitting in Class 1A at UA High School. He rode that feeling all the way through his morning classes, taking notes and participating, though he could hardly remember what he said or did later. When the afternoon arrived, everyone was buzzing about their Foundations of Heroics class, wondering who would be teaching it and what they were going to be doing. Izuku was finally present enough to speculate with everyone else, suggesting that maybe they weren't doing anything too intense for the first day. As soon as the words were out of his mouth, he heard a familiar voice. "I am coming through the door like a normal person." Every head in the room snapped up to see All Might standing in the doorway to the classroom dressed in his Silver Age costume. "I am teaching hero basic training," the hero announced, standing at the front of the room in his classic power pose. "The class that takes and molds you into the heroes you will become by the time you graduate. Today's activity will be battle training." Well, it seems I was wrong about starting things off slowly, Izuku thought. But after yesterday, I don't know why I expected anything different. "And for that, you will need these." All Might pressed a button and the wall opened up to reveal several cases stored in previously hidden alcoves. "In accordance with your Quirk registry and the special forms you filled out before being accepted, your costumes. It is, after all, the image of a hero that takes care of half the battle." The excitement in the room was palpable. A vibrating energy unlike anything Izuku had been in the middle of before. People were already out of their seats and moving toward the cases with their seat number on it. "After you have changed, meet me on ground beta." With that, All Might was gone, leaving behind the chaos of 20 elated hero students. Izuku waited until the others had grabbed their cases before collecting his own, wondering what they had made of his requests. He couldn't exactly put down that he worked with a capture scarf, so he had asked for a durable but flexible material for the suit, reinforced against the most common types of damage. He hadn't really worked with any other weapons beyond the capture scarf, but he put into the request to work his way up to using smoke bombs and flash grenades, as well as other options for non-lethal takedowns, like a taser. He had no idea if any of that was going to make it into his costume. In the locker rooms, he took over a secluded corner to change. The first thing he found in his case was a note he assumed came with every costume. It was from Power Loader, who was apparently the support class teacher, letting him know that if any changes or alterations needed to be made to his costume or gear, that he should submit a request to the support department and schedule a meeting to figure out what he needed. He was grateful for the consideration, even if it was something everyone was given. He was glad to know that changes to costumes were possible, potentially encouraged, and that his rambling requests were not going to handicap him in the future with something he couldn't manage to use. Under the note was the costume itself, and something caught in Izuku's chest at the sight of it. Armed with the knowledge that his best option as a hero would be to go into underground heroics, he had asked for a color scheme suited for hiding in the shadows. This was exactly what he received. The suit wasn't quite black, but it was a shade of charcoal gray that would be easy to miss in the shadows. A dark matte helmet in the same color was with it, promising enough protection to stop a bullet if it came to it, though Izuku hoped he never had cause to test that. The material of the suit did offer about as much protection as the capture scarf normally did, so he unraveled the scarf a bit to have more length to access on his arms before he pulled the suit on over it. The sleeves were loose enough that he wouldn't have trouble sending the ends of the scarf out to grab something. The pair of gloves that came with the suit didn't quite reach the ends of the sleeves, so the scarf had room to unravel from his arm without constricting it. To make up for this small chink in his armor, he wrapped the very ends of the scarf around his wrists. It was a small adjustment to how he normally wore it, but it accounted for the extra length he created unwinding some from around his chest. He found another note with the utility belt that explained the contents of each of the pouches. For the convenience of less required space, one of the upper year support students had made and patented several pellets that worked the same as flashbangs, smoke bombs, and even small explosives. They were carefully sorted and none of them were particularly dangerous unless someone swallowed them. As they looked like colored marbles, Izuku didn't think the urge to eat them would be a factor to deal with. Besides those, there was also a small collection of discs made by another support student that would administer an electrical shock equivalent to a taser charge while taking up less than a fourth of the space of an actual taser. Izuku decided he needed to meet more support students and pick their brains if they were able to build things like this. They could probably put him on the right path to figuring out his own problem with nanotech without too much trouble. Once everything was in place, he raced to catch up with the others already headed to ground beta. It was a cityscape not unlike the fields used for the exam. Looking around, Izuku was fairly certain it had been one of the testing grounds. He could imagine it filled with robots, the buildings crumbling under the assault, though it had been fixed up between now and then. He wasn't the only one to notice this as Ida raised his hand. "Sensei, this appears to be the same field used in the entrance exam. Will we once again be performing cityscape maneuvers?" All Might grinned at them. "Nope. You'll be moving on to step 2. Indoor anti-personnel battle training." He started leading them deeper into the fake city. "You see, in spite of the outdoor battles that make up the majority of what you see in the news, the most insidious fights actually happen inside. Black market deals, hostage situations, these happen in contained spaces that villains can control far easier than they can control an outdoor situation. Which is why you will be split into hero and villain teams for this exercise and face off in 2 versus 2 battles." Izuku listened carefully to the explanation of the scenario as his mind whirled away with possibilities for both sides of the equation. It was a little disappointing that they wouldn't be able to pick their teammates, but no one could really predict who they were going to be working with in an emergency. And something like a bomb threat certainly counted as an emergency situation that would pull in whoever was closest to deal with it. Izuku just hoped he didn't have to team with Bakugo. He couldn't imagine that ending well at all. The bomb in this scenario might be fake, but Bakugo wasn't shy about using his own explosions in any situation, as Izuku's expansive scar tissue proved. Although he had all the nice pellets and taser discs to use, he decided that a mock battle was probably not the best place to test them. It wasn't that he didn't trust the support students' abilities, but he didn't know the scope of what he had access to and didn't want to potentially handicap himself or his teammate by introducing another unknown factor to the equation. "Ah, Team A?" Uraraka said, holding out the piece with a large letter A on it that matched the one in Izuku's hand. "It's nice to be on a team with a friend." "Yeah," he agreed, letting out the breath he'd been holding since Bakugo grabbed his piece. "Now we just need to know if we're on the villain team or the hero team and who we're up against." Izuku was almost sure he knew what the outcome of that was going to be when All Might reached into the boxes. He wished he weren't as sure as he was, but the universe always seemed to conspire to put Bakugo in his path or the other way around. If it weren't for the fact that they hardly interacted at UA, he would think that something was arranged so the teams weren't as random as they were made out to be. The lots All Might pulled out were Team A as the heroes and Team D, Bakugo and Ida, as the villains. As the villains needed time to set up, They disappeared into the building first while Izuku and Uraraka were pulled off to a safe distance to strategize, and the rest of the class disappeared off to a different location to view everything going down. Or, since it was Bakugo, to watch the inevitable fireworks. Okay, Uraraka said once they were alone. Bakugo has those explosions and Ida is really fast. How are we going to handle this? Bakugo is probably going to come straight for me, Izuku sighed. He knows me, and I know him, so his first priority is going to be taking me out. And even beyond that, he's always looking to fight. Uraraka frowned. So, we should avoid him, then? That would probably be best if we can manage it. Not to mention it was more or less what he had promised his mother he would do. He wasn't expecting to be thrown into a fight with him on the second day that made their confrontation more or less inevitable, but if everything went bad, there was still the other half of what he'd promised her. How does your quirk work exactly? What are the limits you're dealing with? I can make up to 3 tons float. Any more than that and I get sick. Same thing if I try to float myself. But you could float someone else without a problem? His mind was spinning away, coming up with ways to avoid the confrontation he really didn't want to have now. What if you floated something and rode on it? She paused. It would have to be a lot bigger than me to make me float too, and I don't think we have anything like that. But yes, I could float you, if that's what you're asking. With my tendrils, I'd have mobility, even weightless. Do you have enough control to float just me and not my clothes? Because I don't know how the fabric would react while weightless, or if I would have the same level of control over it, and we don't really have the time to experiment now. Yes, I can float just you, or I could float just your clothes. I did it with my shoes in the apprehension test. A plan was starting to form in Izuku's mind. Okay, so they are going to be expecting us to come through the door. We're not going to do that. This building has a lot of windows, so we can float up to one of the upper windows and enter through there. You can hold on to me and I'll pull us up. By negating my weight, I will be putting less weight on the tendrils trying to climb the building. Uraraka nodded. Maybe we could go in through the roof? There should be some sort of access there. We'll see. If not, an upper window should do just fine. It wasn't long before they received the go-ahead to approach the building. They circled around to the far side, away from the entrance and any windows the villain team might have been watching from. Uraraka grabbed his hand and Izuku felt a strange sensation of vertigo settle into the pit of his stomach. Suddenly her nausea trying to float herself made more sense. He didn't think he was that bad off, but it was probably worse since it was her power that caused the floating and she was probably constantly aware of the weight of whatever she was floating. The sensation of weightlessness combined with the constant awareness of weight probably didn't agree with her. He wondered if it was more of a mental block, where her mind was rejecting the idea of both realities, weightless but possessing weight, and its only recourse was to make her instantly nauseous. Perhaps that was something to test later. Get on my back, he told her, turning around slowly. He wasn't sure if weightlessness would also affect his normal inertia, but he didn't want to test that now either. She scrambled onto his back, hooking her arms around his neck and her legs around his waist. Once he was reasonably sure she was secure, he sent out the capture scarf to grab onto the drain pipe. Uraraka was lighter than him when he actually had weight, so he nearly pulled them into the wall with his first retraction before he hastily sent out the other end of the scarf to grab the next handhold and redirect the motion. It occurred to him as he was climbing that while he had done this sort of thing before, he had never done it with another person. There had never been anyone else to do it with, no one who would have listened or agreed to experiment with a quirkless Deku like him. He wouldn't always have access to someone with an anti-gravity quirk all the time, so he should see if his normal scarf configuration were able to support more than just him without unnecessarily crushing his ribs. He'd like to think the answer would be yes, but he couldn't be sure without experimentation. Yet another item to add to the list. Maybe if other exercises were different, he would be able to experiment with it in class. He pulled the two of them up onto the roof to find that, yes, there was a hatch leading into the building. That thing you said about making your shoes lighter, do you think it would make your footsteps softer? He asked. We don't want them to know we're up here. It's worth a try, Uraraka said, reaching down to tap the boots of her costume. Oh. I should have returned your gravity first. He waved her off. It's fine. I have my tendrils. And it will be faster to slingshot around without weight. The pressure wave from Bakugo's explosions will make sure I don't take the full brunt of the explosion itself if he comes back. As if summoned, there was an explosion from below, though Izuku wasn't sure if it was a tactic to draw them out or just plain frustration at not finding them. That's probably a good thing, then, Uraraka agreed, glancing down through the floors to wherever Bakugo seemed to be. Hopefully, we can get this over with quickly. She opened the hatch and Izuku pulled himself through first, glancing around carefully. Crates and furniture were stacked haphazardly throughout the room with no particular order or thought. Some were more organized than others, but those were closest to the door. It looked like they had stumbled on some sort of junk room. Uraraka jumped down, landing softly beside him. Huh. I guess that works. Izuku was still floating, so he pulled himself along to the door with one end of the scarf. Well, there weren't really many doors, just open doorways for him to pull himself through before gliding up to the ceiling. He slithered along not unlike a snake, if the snake had its gravity inverted. Uraraka walked beneath and a bit behind him. They were both trying to be quiet and not draw attention to themselves. Izuku winced as another explosion sounded somewhere below them. This one was louder, but still rather distant. As soon as Ida spotted them, he was sure to call Bakugo, but maybe they would be able to complete their objective before that happened. They reached the end of the floor, where a staircase down waited for them. Apparently, the bomb wasn't on the topmost floor, which meant they might have accounted for the possibility of rooftop access and planned accordingly. Should we split up on the next floor? Uraraka asked. So, we can cover more ground? Izuku hesitated. Maybe. How long do you think we have? 7 minutes. Probably about that. Okay. If the bomb isn't on this floor and we don't see either Ida or Bakugo, we meet at the staircase on the opposite end of the floor before going down further. We can't rule out the possibility of an ambush. As if to punctuate his point, there was another explosion, this one much closer. They separated, Izuku wandering along the ceiling to the left while Uraraka tiptoed off to the right. He was almost to the stairs on the far side of the building when his comm crackled. Midoriya, I found Ida, Uraraka whispered. He's with the bomb, 4th door from the stairs we came from. I copy. Headed your way. Any sign of Bakugo? No. Ida's by himself. There was a weird huffing before she added, I think he's monologuing. Izuku turned back the way he came, only to freeze briefly as the sound of Bakugo's cursing came from the stairwell he'd been approaching. Like always, the cursing was accompanied by the little pops of explosions crackling on his palms. Izuku knew that if Bakugo found him right now, it would be very bad. Sending out the scarf from both sleeves, he latched onto 2 doorways sitting across from another as a human slingshot and flung himself down toward the other end of the hall. He twisted in the air, grateful once again that he decided on gymnastics to build his skills. He caught the inner doorway at the end of the hall and swung himself around the corner until he was running sideways along the wall towards Uraraka. Bakugo's coming, he murmured into his comm by way of explanation when he caught the look of alarm on her face. We need to end this quickly. She nodded, pointing to the door she was hiding beside to indicate where Ida was at the moment. What should we do? Izuku pulled himself to a stop above the doorway and glanced in quickly to take stock of the situation. The bomb was sitting in the back of the room away from the door but near the windows. With Bakugo on his way and the exercise quickly counting down on them, they didn't have the time to maneuver outside to get in through the windows. The only thing saving them at the moment was the fact that Ida hadn't noticed them at the door yet, as he was wrapped up in his speech about how the heroes were going to fail and the bomb was going to go off. Can you draw his attention away from the door? Izuku whispered. If you take him one way, I can swing around the other side. Be ready to cancel your quirk on me. Uraraka nodded. I can do that. I'll take him right. You go left. It's a plan. There was an explosion at the end of the building Izuku had run from. Apparently Bakugo had arrived on their floor. He wasn't stupid by any means, so he had to know they were going for the bomb while avoiding him. Now he was bringing the fight to them. Found you, Uraraka shouted into the room, instantly drawing Ida's attention. You're out of luck, hero. Ida replied, I have removed everything you could have used from this room. Darn. Guess I'll just have to take you out first. She dodged to the right in an attempt to outmaneuver him, at least from Ida's perspective. Instead, it was effective at what it was meant to do, distracting him from the doorway so Izuku could catapult into the room and around the pillars on the left. He moved until he was situated against the wall near the bomb. Uraraka, now! His weight returned almost instantly, accompanied by Ida's shocked exclamation, but Izuku was turning his fall into a tumble that brought him right up next to the bomb, where he slapped his hand on it before Ida could properly react to his presence. It was just in time, too, as Bakugo slid into the room with the smell of burnt sugar and a vicious growl. All Might's voice came over the PA system in the building. Hero team wins. Izuku released the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and staggered back a couple steps as Uraraka ran up to hug him. We did it! She squealed, dissolving into giggles probably caused by the sudden loss of adrenaline. Goodness knows Izuku felt like laughing too, but he couldn't bring himself to do more than smile weakly with Bakugo fuming in the doorway. He spun on his heel and left the room, another explosion sounding before he was out of sight, this one strong enough to crack the walls. Izuku winced. Bakugo was probably most angry about not getting a proper fight out of the exercise, but the loss was also part of it. With as powerful a quirk as explosion, he probably anticipated that most of his fights would be head-to-head, something that neither Izuku nor Uraraka were made for. While a gravity quirk like Uraraka's could be used in combat, it wasn't suited for the kind of fighting Bakugo was used to, as it would require a lot of preparation before fighting more directly became feasible. And Izuku with the capture scarf as his fake quirk was also more of a utility hero than a frontline fighter. The only way he and Uraraka would have won the exercise was by utilizing their skills to sneak around and cause misdirection, which was exactly what they did. Are you okay? Uraraka asked. I've never kept anyone up that long, and then you fell. Izuku shook his head, patting her shoulder. It was a controlled fall. I knew what I was doing. I'm not going to lie, being weightless was weird, but I wouldn't mind doing that again sometime. Please return to the observation room, All Might called, drawing them out of their conversation. Ida walked back with them. I was not expecting both of you, he admitted. I had assumed that you would split up to look. We did for a bit, but we came back together. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck sheepishly. Neither of us wanted to run into Bakugo, especially not alone. And then we had to plan around whatever we found when we found the bomb. But where were you? Ida asked. I didn't see you in the hallway when Uraraka was there. That was why I assumed she was alone. He was floating above the door. Uraraka grinned, like he'd been doing for most of the exercise, actually. Ah, that was what you meant. I had wondered. In the observation room, they were met by a chorus of cheers and Izuku felt his cheeks instantly start to burn. Now, All Might was saying as he hovered over them. Who was the MVP for this round? Midoriya was. Yaozu replied. He figured out how to take advantage of Uraraka's quirk in this scenario, and he made the plan to draw Ida's attention away from the door. She turned to look at Izuku. Have you worked without gravity before? Unable to speak, Izuku just shook his head. What? Kirishima exclaimed. But you were so good at it. Yeah, Kaminari agreed. You had to have done something like that before. Izuku shrugged, trying unsuccessfully to disappear into the background. Gymnastics. Ashido slapped him on the back, almost knocking him over. Either way, it was awesome. Especially that wall running bit. It was like you stepped right out of a video game. Yes, well, we should move on to the next team, All Might said. Congratulations, Hero Team, for your win, but we need to move things along. Now that the attention was off of him, Izuku slumped in his chair and let himself drift a bit while he watched the others. No one had figured out yet that his quirk didn't exist, and he hoped he managed to keep that streak up. It was only a matter of time before someone did realize he was actually quirkless, but maybe by then he would have proved he could stand beside everyone else who did have a quirk. Although honestly, just the fact that he was sitting in a foundational heroics class having come out on top for the first exercise of the year meant that he was capable of doing exactly what he was doing. Hopefully, the teachers would see it that way when they finally figured things out. Notes: Sorry that this chapter doesn't have what Aizawa was thinking. That's next chapter. Thank you all for your wonderful comments. They sustain me through the week with happy feelings. Chapter 6. Notes. Sorry for being a day late with this chapter. I had it done, I just hadn't done the editing on it and I was sucked into a couple of stories I didn't want to put down. Between that and my sleep schedule being all kinds of screwed up, I didn't have enough energy to focus on editing. See the end of the chapter for more notes. Chapter text. Izuku didn't see Bakugo again the rest of that day, and he wasn't about to complain about that. Avoidance was the best method for dealing with him, but when he didn't have to actively run away, the world always seemed a little bit better. That probably had something to do with the fact that he wasn't in pain, which was a bit of a novelty. He still felt stretched a little thin, but it wasn't terrible. Izuku had signed up for all of this, so he really had no space to complain about the workload he volunteered to take on. The absence of Bakugo probably had something to do with the fact that he was searching out a part of the school most students avoided. The support classes had a reputation for housing the more destructively insane geniuses UA collected, which wasn't to say they didn't end up in other sections. Just that support classes with their focus on science and invention tended to collect the more eccentric variety known for blowing things up in a fit of inspiration. He wondered what it said about him that he was seeking them out. One of the students he asked in the hallway looked at him like he had a death wish. They didn't ask it aloud, so Izuku didn't get the chance to find out what their reaction would have been to him answering, "Not anymore." It probably would have been more horror, and pity, and discomfort. But support students would have the sort of knowledge and resources he didn't currently have access to and would probably be willing to help him if he played the part of a guinea pig/sounding board. He was starting to doubt his own sanity when he heard the explosion. Unlike Bakugo's, this explosion sounded heavier, like it had more substance and less flash. It was also helpful, as it identified the main support lab by the smoke leaking out around the edges of the large metal door. Even without the smoke, he would probably have been able to identify it, as there were marks burned into the wall around it and uneven patches of plaster where the door had likely been blown off its hinges and later repaired. There was a reinforced panel next to it, covered in a thin layer of soot, a few old scorch marks, and a plethora of dents and scratches from whatever abuse it had taken in its tenure as the support lab's doorbell. Izuku moved until he wasn't standing in front of the door. Not only did it open out, it clearly had a history of being blasted off into the hallway, which would definitely crush him if he were standing in the way. And for all he knew, blowing the door off its hinges was a form of initiation, or a test to see if someone was smart enough to avoid obvious hazards. Even if most people had to be crazy coming down this way at all. He rang the doorbell and listened as there was a frantic scuffling inside before the door was opened by Power Loader. "Yes?" the support teacher asked. "You're a hero student, right? Is there a problem with your costume?" No." Izuku reached up to rub the back of his neck. "I was actually wondering if I could talk to you or one of the support students about a personal project of mine." He could feel Power Loader staring down at him, even though he couldn't see his eyes in the helmet. "What sort of project?" Izuku flinched under the gaze. He never had a lot of luck getting a teacher to let him do something non-standard, no matter how reasonable the request. And he wasn't honestly sure if his interest would be considered reasonable in the slightest. "Nanotech." "Are you asking or telling me?" "Telling. I have an interest in constructing and building nanotech, and I wanted to know if there's any way I could talk to someone about it." There was a moment of silence where Power Loader just looked at him. Then he groaned and tilted his head toward the ceiling. "It was only a matter of time. I should have known eventually that the hero course was going to have one of you." Izuku winced. "I'm sorry?" No. Honestly, I think someone like you has been overdoing the hero course." A sudden thrill of panic shot through Izuku's body. "Someone like me, an all-arounder," Power Loader explained, apparently missing the obvious distress he had caused. "Someone who wants to pick up a lot of skills we teach here, including invention. Have you made anything yet?" Izuku shook his head, trying to force the panic out with the movement. "No, just a lot of theory. I've looked into KSSI a lot in the past, and the core of their prosthetics is nanotechnology. That's what got me interested in it in the first place. which wasn't a total lie. But finding the capture scarf was the real catalyst for that vein of research, and that was a secret he wasn't going to provide even with all of the truths packed in around it. Their nanobots are self-replicating, provided they have enough material they can use, and that's just fascinating to me. But it obviously needs precise programming, otherwise it would consume and replicate like a virus, and then you would have a really big problem on your hands because you wouldn't be able to stop it. Power Loader chuckled, cutting off his rambling. You're definitely an all-arounder. 1A or 1B? 1A, shit, how did Shouta get you? Never mind. He turned to go back into the lab and beckoned for Izuku to follow him. Hero courses are always a little packed, so you definitely won't have time for all of the support courses you need to be able to work on that on your own. Which is why I came to ask for help, Izuku admitted. I know programming is going to be half the battle with this, making sure the bots know what to do and when to stop, so I was going to join the programming club, but I know I need more of the mechanical knowledge. Who's this? Izuku jumped as a soot-covered girl with pink hair and yellow eyes appeared right in front of him. Hatsume, don't scare this one away. Power Loader turned back to him. Sorry about her. Hatsume is one of my best students this year. His very best student, Hatsume bragged. Hatsume, future CEO of Hatsume Industries. Nice to meet you, Stranger-kun. I'm Midoriya Izuku. He bowed, feeling the scarf tighten slightly around his ribs. Did you come for one of my babies? Izuku's mind short-circuited in the face of her manic grin and enthusiastic offering of a child. Her inventions, Power Loader explained. And no, Hatsume, he's here because he has an interest in support tech on his own. Hatsume's gaze suddenly sharpened into something gleeful and calculating. Izuku shrank under it. That sort of expression never spelled good things for him. Specific branch or something more general? Nanotech, Izuku whispered, hoping the answer would satisfy her and she didn't get mad at him. Ooh. That's new. Hatsume, don't drag him into your crazy, please. There was a sort of amused exasperation in Power Loader's voice, which could be either good or bad for him. He might never come back. You don't know how long I've been waiting for an all-arounder to show up at this school. He led Izuku over to his desk and scribbled down a quick note. Give that to Aizawa next time you see him, and we'll try to work something out. Even if it's just sometime after school here in the labs or figuring out how to put a science class in your course schedule, we'll figure out a way to make this work. Thank you, Sensei. If this works out, you can thank me by devoting as much effort to it as you would to your hero courses. Izuku nodded vigorously, as though he would do anything less. He never wanted to disappoint the people who actually put time and effort into him and his interests. And when it came to making himself a better hero, he was willing to drive himself to exhaustion to meet his own expectations. He had done that more than once in the past, to the exasperation and worry of his mother, but everything paid off in the end. He was in a far better place now than he'd ever been, and he was sure that most of it had to do with getting into the hero course. He wasn't about to jeopardize his place in UA by giving half of what he could do. The school motto was Plus Ultra, wasn't it? How could he in good conscience do anything else? Midoriya-kun. He turned back to see Hatsume waving at him. Next time you come I can introduce you to my babies. Maybe we could work together on something once you have the right foundation in place. In spite of himself, Izuku smiled. I think I'd like that. Hatsume was the personification of mad science if he'd ever seen it, but he couldn't help but think of the sort of things they could accomplish together. She had all the answers, and Izuku was very good at asking the right questions. Glancing back at Power Loader before he left, he wondered how quickly their collaboration would drive him to distraction. For all he seemed to be worried about her chasing him away, the man was ridiculously fond of her, explosions and all. If she and Izuku did start collaborating on projects, he would probably complain in public but start bragging once it was just the teachers around, especially around Aizawa-sensei. And it felt nice to be part of a non-hostile student-teacher relationship for the first time. With luck, this trend would continue. If not, well, he knew how to deal with that, too. He honestly wasn't sure where Aizawa was on that spectrum at the moment, but he hoped he'd get some answers soon. The uncertainty piggybacking on his anxiety was trying to kill him. Shouta would have preferred to be present for the first foundational heroics lesson, but apparently not trusting All Might not to fuck that up wasn't a good enough reason to lurk nearby. And probably exactly why Nezu had sent him out on an errand during his free period in that block. So, it was the footage of their first exercise that he was coming back to, rather than the exercise itself. It wasn't the worst situation. He was getting a good idea of what his students were capable of. That being said, he had put off the matchup with Midoriya and Bakugo until much later. He was willing to admit that Midoriya had some good instincts, especially with that flip he managed in the 50-meter dash while blinded, but Bakugo wore his rage and entitlement like a badge, and Shouta wasn't unaware that there was some kind of history between the two. They had gone to the same middle school and he had assumed that they'd applied together, but Midoriya avoided Bakugo wherever possible. Meanwhile, Bakugo was either oblivious to the backlash of his quirk on others or he didn't care, and Shouta was leaning toward the latter. He couldn't say the kid was without potential, but if he didn't start thinking more about his actions beyond attack, Shouta was more than willing to fast-track him through an expulsion. A lack of care for one's surroundings was deadly in the field, and not usually for the person who exercised that lack of care. Bakugo's was one attitude. Shouta refused to graduate because it was a recipe for civilian casualties, and he didn't want that on his or Bakugo's conscience. He made a note to talk to Todoroki about why he wouldn't use his fire. Given the burn on his face that wasn't explained in his file, it was entirely possible that portion of his quirk was trauma-locked, but asking the boy would be the fastest way to get that answer. He also didn't treat it like the team exercise it was supposed to be, so that was just another thing they would have to talk about. Endeavor might be able to get away with feeding his own ego, but the ratings he got and the amount of damage he caused were example enough for why that wasn't going to work for good heroes moving forward. Heroes sometimes needed to work with other heroes, no matter how powerful they were on their own. The opposite view of that sort of thing could be seen between Yaoyorozu and Mineta. Yaoyorozu tried to get Mineta to work with her, but he kept making lewd comments about her costume and leering whenever he thought she wasn't looking. From the way she shivered, she knew he was looking at her every time. Shouta made a note to keep an eye on him. He was already on thin ice from the Quirk apprehension test, and he was already starting to look like a sexual assault charge in the making. If that sort of behavior continued, Shouta would have no qualms whatsoever kicking him to the curb. Especially since the two of them could have won if Mineta had just taken his head out of his ass and helped. Yaoyorozu's strategy of filling several rooms with things that made loud noises and creating a decoy bomb room were solid, but she only had time to set up about half of it, and Mineta could have laid some excellent traps for Kaminari and Jiro if he'd been focused on the exercise instead of his partner's cleavage. The matchup between Tokoyami and Asui against Kirishima and Sero was actually fairly balanced. It wasn't that surprising, though, that Tokoyami and Asui came out on top, especially since Sero's strategy drastically lowered light levels in the room with the fake bomb. It prevented Asui from entering through the windows and nicely bottlenecked the area, but Dark Shadow had a lot more power and was easily able to pin Kirishima in place while Asui distracted Sero and Tokoyami got to the bomb. In her matchup, Ashido proved that she was both versatile and adaptable, especially when separated from Aoyama. She managed to keep Koda's rats away with her acid, spread it on the floor to have the advantage of maneuverability over Sato, and even weakened a section of the floor in preparation for leading Sato into it. All in all, a simple but solid strategy. Shouta made a note to recommend self-defense lessons for Koda, and maybe something to give him a bit more confidence. He could have helped overwhelm Ashido with Sato but stood back attempting to protect the bomb as though he didn't trust himself to actually help. When he finally got around to Bakugo and Ida against Midoriya and Uraraka, he had a small list of things to look into with each of his students. As much as he hoped these ones would be unproblematic, the fact that Bakugo and Midoriya were involved killed the hope before it had time to grow. At least he had come into this knowing they would probably have the most issues. And, by God, was he right. The first thing he noticed was that Bakugo, like Todoroki, did not play well with others. As soon as they placed the bomb, he went off on his own without really consulting his partner, searching for the fight. Shouta had Bakugo's test scores to prove that the kid was intelligent and the results from the Quirk apprehension test to prove that he could think strategically about how to deal with a problem. But it was like all of that got thrown out the window in favor of hunt and destroy. If Uraraka and Midoriya had entered the building normally, someone probably would have gotten badly hurt trying to get by. That being said, the hero team hadn't gone the normal route to enter the building. They had circled around to the back and climbed up the building after Uraraka negated Midoriya's gravity. What was surprising was that she didn't release him once they were inside. Midoriya bobbed around like a balloon, using his tendrils to pull himself along. There was something about those tendrils that Shouta couldn't put his finger on. He'd had the feeling that it was somehow familiar during the Quirk apprehension tests and he was getting it again. They were familiar. Midoriya didn't produce the tendrils, he knew that much. He had the capacity to control them, but they weren't physically part of him. Maybe that was what was screwing with his head? The kid was using them like extra limbs when Shouta knew they weren't. It was some type of telekinesis quirk that only worked with certain materials. And they were fairly basic materials too, a durable polyester reinforced with wires. It shouldn't have been so unusual. Quirks were weird and didn't always make sense. Why was he so hung up on Midoriya's? When he finally got the chance to read through the file on the kid, there was a note that his quirk was registered ludicrously late, less than a year ago. It set off all sorts of alarm bells in his head about why Midoriya would hide his quirk for so long. As much as he wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, Shouta had a feeling he would need to talk to the kid about it at some point. Actually, he knew he was going to have to talk to Midoriya about a few things. The logical ruse had forced the best out of everyone in the Quirk apprehension test, but Midoriya attacked everything like it was the last thing he was going to do. He used his quirk in unusual ways in every single test besides the endurance run, and he always looked like he was on the edge of passing out. For something that seemed to be an emitter quirk, the kid used it like a mutation, like the tendrils were part of him. There was a fluidity to his movements in tandem with the tendrils that looked almost like a symbiotic relationship. It was more than he'd seen out of most aspiring hero students. So why exactly was Midoriya so desperate? The thought was driven from his head as he watched Midoriya freeze near the stairwell down to the second floor, where Bakugo was letting off explosions. Then the problem child hooped a tendril in a couple of doorways across from one another and fired himself like a slingshot down the hall and back the way he'd come. If there had been any doubt in Shouta's mind that Midoriya was going to be a reckless pain in his ass, the boy managed to grind whatever remained of it into dust. Midoriya didn't even bother to slow himself down to take the corner, managing to catch the final doorway through skill or luck, still moving faster than Ida could probably run, and whipped himself around into the adjacent hallway Uraraka had taken. The kid was going to get himself killed, and the one saving grace here was that he wasn't always going to have his gravity negated by a partner. Although Shouta had the sinking feeling that it wouldn't matter as much whether or not the kid was bound by the laws of gravity, he was going to break them either way. He turned up the audio to listen to Midoriya and Uraraka's plan, although it was mostly Midoriya's idea. Again, Shouta was begrudgingly impressed by his good instincts. He was using the fact that most people don't look up or pay attention to the ceiling. Ida's thoughts regarding Uraraka's quirk were on her using inanimate objects as projectiles, and so had cleared the room. Clearly, he hadn't known or expected her to use it on her partner, especially as using one's quirk on their partner would, unless negotiated, be a form of assault. And who would want their gravity negated? Midoriya, apparently. The flip as the problem child pushed off the wall sent Shouta looking back through Midoriya's file, where he found that yes, the kid had taken gymnastics. Which was probably why he knew how to function in the air. He'd only been doing it for a few years. There was probably a reason for that. Most people he knew that were in gymnastics started early or got recruited through something else. From the bareness of Midoriya's file, he didn't imagine the kid was noticeable enough to be recruited for anything. The footage continued just a bit beyond the capture of the bomb. Bakugo was definitely going to be a problem as well, and not a particularly good variety of trouble either. There was an excellent camera angle that managed to catch the incandescent rage and disbelief that led on to Bakugo's face as he watched Midoriya secure the bomb. If All Might hadn't called the exercise there, The explosion he let off in the hallway probably would have been in Midoriya's face instead. Shouta didn't understand the anger and frustration pouring off the kid. Yeah, Midoriya didn't have a quirk nearly as powerful as his, and he and Uraraka managed to secure the win, but there was something deeper to it, something he didn't have the perspective to figure out just yet. So, he dove back into their files, putting them side by side to compare them. It wasn't just that they came from the same middle school. They were in the same class all the way back to when they first started school. And before that, the boys went to the same daycare facility. But there was nothing in their files to indicate that they really knew each other, beyond the fact that the parent or parents of one happened to be the emergency contact for the other. It shouldn't be a hostile relationship if their families were that close. At best, it should have been a rivalry, but something about that struck Shouta as false. Neither Bakugo nor Midoriya was mentioned in the others' reports from their teachers, which didn't track with the antagonism Shouta had observed from Bakugo. The boy wasn't particularly subtle about it, as he probably wasn't subtle about anything, but that sort of note should have been in one or the other's file. However, the more Shouta read, the more muddled the picture became. For all that the files contained the summation of their achievements, the reports from their teachers on their character and behavior, the records of their academic abilities, they were remarkably sterile. The notes on Midoriya's file were so basic and unimpressive that Shouta had to wonder if they even knew who they were talking about. Having spent less than a day observing them, he knew that Midoriya was driven, intelligent, resourceful, and constantly pushing his own boundaries of thought and body. While the recklessness was easier to see in a combat situation, Shouta found it hard to believe that the sheer desperation never spilled over into other aspects of his life. But to read the reports from his teachers, Midoriya was supposedly painfully average in all areas, an unremarkable but good student who could probably focus more on his classwork instead of whatever project he brought from home. There was no mention of what that project was, only that it was in a notebook and so should not have been particularly disruptive. That was the most specific thing Midoriya's teachers had mentioned. Bakugo's file had a similarly distilled figure present. If distilled was the right word for someone described as respectful, driven, a model student. Shouta had yet to see anything approaching tolerance out of Bakugo, much less respect. Driven he could believe, and Bakugo could be considered a model student from a purely academic point of view. But that wasn't what the file was for. It was meant to give an accurate picture of a student's character, based on interactions both in and out of the classroom. While there was the possibility that Bakugo spent the first 14 years of his life pulling the wool over everyone's eyes regarding his own reckless disregard for people and property, that would again require subtlety he didn't have. Something wrong, Shouta? Nemori asked, leaning over his desk. You've just been sitting there staring at your computer for the past 15 minutes. Shouta sighed. I think I need to talk to Nezu. Why? Is there something wrong? I'm not sure yet, but I think there might be. At least with whoever last had their hands on these files. Nemori shifted into his space to look at them. Midoriya and Bakugo? Why do you think that? They're too clean. Moreover, they're absolutely useless. Either their teachers didn't bother to pay any attention to them, which is unlikely, or someone has tampered with them. He let out another heavy sigh. There's too much missing for me to believe anything but the most basic information in these files. And according to Midoriya's, his quirk was only registered last year, something that should have been on his teacher's radar considering it wouldn't have been in his file before. Nemori hummed. There's only so many reasons why someone wouldn't have a registered quirk on file. Exactly. Which is why I think I need to talk to Nezu. A message appeared in the corner of Shouta's computer screen. Available now, feel free to come on up. Nezu. It was Nemori's turn to sigh. Looks like he's bugged the office again, or something. Considering their principal loved to lean into all of his eccentricities, Shouta wasn't about to discount the possibility of Nezu lurking in the vents and listening in. He'd be back in his office by the time Shouta got there, but it was a possibility. Just like the idea that all of the computers themselves were Nezu's bugs. It wasn't like he was about to start doing his paperwork on actual paper to avoid it. Being spied on was a fact of life with Nezu as their boss, and the sooner one learned to deal with it or ignore it, the better one's life became, provided they didn't do something to upset the almighty rat bear. That would only make things worse. Gathering the files, Shouta made his way up to Nezu's office. The door swung open as he arrived, meaning that either Nezu had been watching the cameras the whole time, or had known enough about Shouta's tendencies to time the opening of the door perfectly. With his quirk, it could be either. Nezu turned around in his chair like a cinema supervillain trying to make a dramatic debut. Aizawa, you always manage to bring me the most interesting problems. Aizawa didn't bother to argue. They had a lot to talk about if he was reading into everything correctly, and he wanted to get home eventually. With a sigh, he handed over a copy of the paperwork he'd been going over and settled in. This was going to be a long night. Settled in.